Hi guys. Tonight we walk together into a place where time seems frozen, not only by centuries of memory, but by the very air itself, sharp with winter chill. Picture yourself in the echoing corridors of a medieval convent, the stone walls unyielding, the flagstones beneath your feet stiff with frost. You feel your breath catch in the cold, rising in soft mist, as though even the air here whispers of discipline and devotion. It is nightfall, and outside the wind moans against narrow slits of windows, carrying with it the bitterness of January. You pause, tugging your cloak tighter, wondering how on earth anyone could endure such biting cold. The simple truth? You probably wouldn't survive this without years of practice, obedience, and a healthy dose of stubborn faith. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Let's slip deeper into the story. The convent corridors are quiet, yet not peaceful. Silence here is not gentle but firm, almost oppressive, an echo of the rule of Saint Benedict that demanded stillness after sunset. The torches are few, their flames barely holding back the shadows that lean across the stone arches. Your footsteps resound louder than you wish, a lonely rhythm against walls designed for austerity rather than comfort. Each sound seems magnified, as though the stones themselves disapprove of your intrusion into the nightly hush. You trail your fingers along the wall. The stone is cold, rough, almost damp from centuries of poor insulation. It feels like the wall itself is drawing warmth from you, as though the convent is a hungry creature. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval convents were often built of heavy masonry, intended for permanence rather than comfort, and this architecture trapped cold as effectively as it held prayers. Some nuns would later complain in their chronicles that the winters seeped into their very bones, and their illnesses often carried the flavor of that chill. Still, the convent at night is not without beauty. Lanterns left burning near shrines create tiny halos of gold in the darkness, little flickering sanctuaries of light. The scent of beeswax lingers faintly, mingled with the sharper tang of burning tallow. You hear a faint rustling, a sister shuffling past, her steps measured, her face hidden in the shadow of her veil. You imagine her lips moving silently, reciting a psalm in her head, the rhythm of prayer keeping pace with the rhythm of her steps. A quirky tidbit you might not expect. In some convents, the chill of the corridors was actually welcomed as a way of testing resolve. Chroniclers note that some sisters deliberately walked barefoot on the icy floors during winter, believing the sting of cold kept them humble before God. You wince at the thought, imagining that sting turning quickly into numbness, then pain, before settling into an ache that lingered long into the night. Historians still debate whether this level of austerity was universally practiced, or whether certain convents, especially wealthier ones patronized by noble families, softened their conditions with more luxuries. The records are patchy, some written with pride at the strict discipline, others almost boasting of their modest comfort. You are left, as always, with the tantalizing uncertainty of a life lived behind walls where the truth was both routine and extraordinary. You pause in the corridor, listening. The convent bell has not yet rung for compline, the final prayer before rest, but the atmosphere is already hushed. Somewhere down the passage, you hear the faint creak of wood, perhaps a door opening to a tiny cell. A draught snakes along the floor, carrying with it the smell of winter earth from the cloister garden outside. You close your eyes and picture the sisters, each moving quietly, preparing themselves for the long night ahead. Here, winter does not merely happen outside. It lives in the very bones of the convent. You feel it pressing at your chest, clinging to your breath, sliding beneath your robe. You know the sisters must have felt it too, every night, year after year. And yet they walked these same corridors, whispering prayers, carrying candles, pulling their thin habits tighter, ready to face a night that promised little rest and even less warmth. You step away from the corridor, easing open a heavy wooden door with iron hinges that groan as if they too suffer from the cold. Inside, you find the tiny chambers where the nuns rested, each no larger than the space of a cupboard, bare as a monk's conscience. These were the cells, the private sleeping quarters meant to remind every sister of poverty, humility, and detachment from earthly pleasure. And yet, despite their simplicity, you can almost sense the weight of lives lived within them, prayers whispered in the dark, dreams dissolved into candle smoke. The walls close around you. Each cell is built with stone or timber, thick enough to separate one nun from another, but never thick enough to keep out the cold. You see a single small window, unglazed, with only a wooden shutter to bar the freezing night air. Even when shut tight, you feel the breeze snake in, a reminder that insulation was centuries away from being invented. Your shoulders instinctively hunch, as though the cold has crawled into the room with you. One mainstream historical fact is that these cells typically contained almost nothing, just a bed frame or low pallet, a straw mattress, a coarse woolen blanket, and perhaps a small table for devotional items. Personal possessions were discouraged, though many sisters tucked away rosaries, crosses, or handwritten scraps of psalms. You imagine sitting here, night after night, with little more than a draughty corner, a stiff bed, and a wooden crucifix above your head for company. The floor under your feet creaks. It is wood, but worn, stained dark with years of frost melting in little puddles. You picture the nuns stepping in barefoot after evening prayers, their feet already raw from stone corridors. Sometimes, in harsher winters, frost crystals bloomed on the very inside walls. You can almost hear the faint crackle of ice forming, like a spider weaving threads of glass across the rough plaster. And then, a quirky tidbit. Not every convent had private cells. Some, especially in poorer or more remote regions, offered only shared dormitories with rows of straw pallets pressed side by side. In such places, privacy was non-existent, and the sisters might murmur prayers together as they lay down, forming a kind of whispered chorus that floated over the cold room before dying into silence. Chroniclers even joke that snores were considered a form of unintentional chant. You smile, half amused, half chilled by the thought. Historians remain divided on how uniformly such arrangements existed. Some argue that wealthier convents reserved private cells only for senior nuns, while novices endured the communal dormitories. Others suggest that the choice was less about hierarchy and more about practicality. The size of the building, the funds available, and the climate in which the convent was built. The evidence is scattered across charters and inventories, leaving you to wander through the ambiguity, imagining the full spectrum of experiences. You glance toward the tiny bed. It looks more symbolic than practical, hardly long enough for a grown woman to stretch out comfortably. The straw mattress gives off a faint, musty odor that clings to your clothes as you sit. You shift, feeling sharp stalks pressing through the thin cover. No softness here, only the relentless reminder that comfort was considered a temptation, not a gift. The blanket is coarse wool, scratchy against your skin, its color dull, perhaps a faded gray or brown. It was meant to warm, but warmth is generous, and this cloth offers only a grudging shield. On the table lies a candle stub, its wax hardened in drips like frozen tears. The faint smell of beeswax lingers, mingling with the earthy scent of straw. You can imagine a nun kneeling here, her knees pressed into the hard wood, whispering prayers by this tiny flame before surrendering herself to the cold embrace of sleep. And yet, as you look closer, you notice the floor marked with faint scratches, as though a stool or chest once shifted here. Perhaps a sister dared to keep a small box hidden, filled with memories of her former life, a ribbon, a ring, a letter. You lie back, eyes tracing the low ceiling above. The silence is almost absolute. You hear only the faint crackle of your breath in the freezing air and the muffled toll of a distant bell. The cell seems both a sanctuary and a prison, a space where one could meet God in solitude, but also meet the bone-deep loneliness of winter nights. You can almost feel the mingling of peace and despair, devotion and fatigue, coiling around the room like invisible incense. The convent was meant to be a fortress of the spirit, yet here, in these small cells, the very human struggle for warmth, comfort, and rest was fought night after night. You imagine a nun lying on her straw mattress, eyes wide open in the dark, whispering a psalm to distract herself from the cold biting her toes. And still, somehow she endured. You sit down on the low pallet and let your hand sink into the straw mattress, if sink is even the right word. The truth is, the bedding offers almost no give at all, just a prickly resistance that scratches at your skin through the thin layer of cloth. The smell rises dry, musty, with a faint sweetness of hay long past its prime. This is what the nuns lay upon night after night, their bodies pressed into a bed that seemed designed less for rest than for reminder. The blanket, heavy but itchy, is made from coarse wool spun by the sisters themselves or by local peasants under obligation. It scratches your neck and arms, leaving behind that telltale irritation that no shifting position can soothe. Imagine pulling it up over your shoulders, the weight comforting at first, then stifling as the wool rubs against your skin. There's no linen sheet beneath you, no cushion, just straw poking through its thin sack. Comfort was a worldly luxury, and here in the convent, the aim was to strip you of such softness until only your faith could keep you warm. Chroniclers often noted that straw mattresses had to be changed several times a year, not because they wore out, but because they collected lice and fleas. You picture the sisters dutifully emptying their sacks into the convent yard, beating them clean, then refilling them with fresh straw brought in from nearby farms. Still, within weeks, the pests returned, scratching at skin already raw from cold. A bed that promised rest often delivered only sleeplessness, broken by the scuttling itch of tiny intruders. But not all was entirely grim. In some records, you find the faintest hints of humour. A curious custom reported in certain convents involved novices sneaking handfuls of aromatic herbs, lavender, rosemary, or thyme into their straw, hoping to mask the smell and perhaps deter pests. It is a small rebellion against the relentless simplicity, a splash of fragrance in an otherwise odorless cell. You imagine a sister lying back, inhaling faint herbal sweetness, letting her mind drift to summer gardens buzzing with bees. The question of how widespread such practices were remains unresolved. Some researchers question if herb-stuffed mattresses were commonplace, or whether they were limited to wealthier convents in southern Europe, where such plants grew abundantly. In northern regions, where winters were longer and harsher, straw alone may have been the rule, leaving the sisters to endure without fragrance or comfort. The patchwork of evidence leaves you wondering, were these little luxuries acts of quiet defiance, or simply everyday normality in some corners of the medieval church? You shift again, trying to find a comfortable angle. The straw crunches beneath you, uneven, pressing into your back. For a moment, you imagine yourself one of them, tired from a day of prayer, fasting, and labor, your muscles sore, your belly never quite full. You lower your head to the flat, lumpy pillow stuffed with more straw, and you feel its roughness scratching at your cheek. No feather softness here, only the brittle texture of stalks that refuse to yield. The air is icy. You pull the blanket tighter, but the cold still seeps in at the edges. You picture sisters wrapping themselves in every layer of habit they owned, their veils still clinging to their heads as they tried to sleep, the stiffness of cloth pressing against their ears. The sound of their own breathing would be loud in the silence, mingled with the occasional rustle of straw, the cough of a neighbour, or the creak of wood shifting in the cold. One detail preserved in convent inventories is the allowance of a single woolen cover per nun. No more. Sharing was sometimes permitted in the poorest houses, but excess was not. In fact, one abbess in the 13th century reprimanded her sisters for trying to hoard extra blankets, declaring it a failure of discipline. You can almost see the scene. A stern woman in heavy robes scolding shivering nuns for wanting more warmth, her voice carrying the authority of both God and rule. You think of the discipline behind these choices. To endure a straw mattress and a scratchy blanket was not just about poverty, it was about cultivating humility, stripping the body of luxury so the soul could focus on prayer. Each poke of straw, each itch of wool, was meant to remind the sisters that they were pilgrims on earth, not settlers. Their true rest, after all, lay beyond this life. And so, night after night, they laid themselves down in discomfort, believing that every prickle of the straw brought them one step closer to holiness. And yet, human bodies do not surrender so easily. You can imagine a nun turning restlessly, trying to find a position where her hips didn't ache, where her shoulders didn't press painfully into the straw. She sighs, adjusts her blanket, whispers a prayer, and finally lets exhaustion pull her under. The sleep she finds is thin, fragile, easily broken by the cold or the sound of a bell, but it is sleep nonetheless, and in it she finds the strength to rise again when morning calls. The convent at night is not entirely still. Somewhere down the hall, a sister coughs. In another cell, straw rustles as someone shifts in her sleep. A faint smell of tallow smoke lingers, drifting from a candle left too long. Outside, the wind presses against the shutters, searching for cracks. And within, you lie stiffly on straw, feeling the mattress breathe out its dust, the blanket scratch your arms, the air sting your nose. It is not comfort you find here, but discipline, persistence, and the echo of countless lives that endured exactly the same harshness. The straw cradles you poorly, but it holds you all the same. And as you close your eyes, you understand. This was the convent bed, unyielding, humble, and cold. And yet, it was the place where dreams rose like incense, mingling discomfort with devotion, turning restless nights into whispered offerings of faith. You leave the narrow cell behind and step into a larger chamber, one that immediately feels different. The air is just as frigid, but here, rows of bedding stretch across the floor beneath the looming timbers of the roof. This is the dormitory shared sleeping quarters that stripped away even the meager privacy of a single cell. Instead, you see wooden pallets, crude cots, and straw mattresses laid side by side, forming a humble army of beds beneath the rafters. The space smells of straw, wool, and human breath clinging to the stone walls. Shared dormitories were more common in poorer convents where funds or space did not allow for individual cells. Contemporary records describe these communal sleeping halls as crowded, cold, and noisy, though still governed by strict silence. You imagine the sisters filing in after compline, moving with quiet purpose, lowering themselves onto their pallets with only the rustle of cloth and straw to mark the transition from prayer to rest. The hush would be profound, yet pierced by the unavoidable sounds of human life. A cough here, a sneeze there, the creak of wood, the shuffling of feet trying to get warm. Some convent annals mention with an almost wry tone that novices often struggled most in these dormitories. A curious anecdote survives of a young sister who wept each night at the cold until her elders chastised her, telling her tears were wasted when prayer was the stronger blanket. You can almost see her curled on her pallet, sobbing quietly into her sleeve while others pretended not to notice. It is a sharp reminder that faith and discipline were expected to outweigh even the body's need for comfort. The evidence about who slept where is murky. Some scholars continue to puzzle over whether shared dormitories were seen as spiritually preferable to private cells. One theory suggests that common sleeping spaces helped enforce humility and discouraged vanity, since no nun could claim a private sanctuary. Others argue the arrangement was simply practical, a matter of architectural resources, not ideology. Without consistent records, you're left navigating a haze of partial truths and competing interpretations, each hinting at different shades of daily convent life. You sit on one of the pallets. The straw crunches and shifts, releasing that same familiar dusty smell. Beside you lies another bed, barely an arm's length away. You picture sisters sleeping shoulder to shoulder, wrapped tightly in their habits, their breaths rising in small clouds. In such close quarters, warmth might spread slightly from body to body, but so too would discomfort. A snore here, a restless shuffle there, and suddenly the silence of the rule feels fragile, tested by the realities of human sleep. Above, the rafters groan in the wind. You glance up and imagine the snow piled heavy on the roof, cold pressing down through the timbers. The dormitory would have been draughty, every gust of wind sliding between loose tiles or through cracks in the shutters. In the dead of night, the sisters must have pulled their blankets higher, tucking them under their chins, whispering prayers against the cold. You hear the faint clinking of rosary beads as a nun fingers them in the dark, hoping the rhythm of prayer will lull her into rest. One description from a 13th century visitation report notes that the sisters did not always remain in silence at night, hinting that whispers of comfort or even muffled laughter sometimes rose between the pallets. The inspector clearly disapproved, recording it as a failure of discipline. Yet for a moment, you can imagine the relief of two novices murmuring to one another in the darkness, sharing their fear of the cold or trading small reassurances. These tiny human rebellions were not meant to overthrow the rule, but to make life just a bit more bearable. You stretch out on the pallet and close your eyes. The sounds of the dormitory form a strange symphony. The scrape of straw, the distant toll of a bell, the soft rhythm of breathing layered one atop another. It is both intimate and impersonal, a reminder that you are one among many, bound not only by vows but by the relentless cold. The air stings your nose, and you pull the blanket closer, your body curling inward against the chill. It remains unclear to modern historians whether some dormitories were divided by rank, with choir nuns, those who sang the divine office, given slightly better accommodations, while lay sisters endured the harsher end of the hall. Some records hint at such distinctions, while others emphasize uniformity as a virtue. The uncertainty itself speaks volumes, reminding you how fragmentary our view of convent life truly island. Each convent was a world of its own, with rules interpreted differently, comfort granted or withheld according to the priorities of the abbess and the resources of the house. You open your eyes again. The room is dark, but you can still make out rows of simple shapes under blankets, each sister folded into her own cocoon of wool and straw. You imagine the collective dreams swirling here, visions of Christ, of summer fields, of families left behind. The hall hums with their breath, 1,000 whispered prayers woven into the very timber of the roof. It is a strange kind of intimacy, built not on choice but on discipline, the body subdued in service of the spirit. And yet, for all its austerity, there is something almost tender about this space. The sisters endured it together, side by side, carrying one another through the cold by nothing more than presence. You feel that solidarity now, sitting among them, wrapped in scratchy wool, breathing the same icy air. Alone, perhaps the cold would be unbearable. But together, in silence, the weight of it is just possible to endure. The dormitory fades behind you, and now you stand in the cloister again as the bell tolls softly in the distance. The hour of compline is over, and with it, the day of spoken words has ended. From this moment until the sun rises, the convent enters what was called the Great Silence. No chatter, no laughter, no idle murmur, only prayer in the heart and the sound of the wind threading through the cloister arches. You feel the weight of that hush pressing against your ears, as though the stones themselves forbid you to speak. This silence was not simply practical. Contemporary writings reveal that it carried spiritual significance. By enforcing quiet after dark, the sisters were meant to imitate the stillness of Christ in the tomb, surrendering both voice and will to God's presence. The hush itself was an act of devotion, a nightly sacrifice of words. You imagine lying down in your scratchy bedding, lips sealed, mind buzzing with the residue of the day, and trying to surrender it all to silence. Yet silence is never perfect. The body resists rules, and the night has its own voice. A cough erupts somewhere in the hall, followed by the rustle of a blanket. Straw crunches under a restless shift. Teeth chatter faintly in the cold. You sense how fragile the stillness must have been, constantly challenged by the basic noises of survival. A stray sneeze might echo like a trumpet in the dormitory, and though no one dared to laugh aloud, you can almost picture the hidden smiles forming in the dark. An odd little note from a visitation record in Burgundy complains that the sisters sometimes hummed to themselves while falling asleep, turning the silence into a kind of whispered song. Imagine a novice too cold to sleep, softly reciting psalms under her breath, the rhythm soothing her as much as any blanket. The inspector, naturally, recorded this as a breach of discipline, but to you, it feels deeply human. Silence was commanded, but hearts often rebelled in the gentlest of ways. Scholars continue to debate how strictly the Great Silence was kept across Europe. Some argue that well-funded convents, with tighter oversight, enforced it rigidly, while rural houses allowed more leniency, knowing their sisters needed warmth and companionship more than rigid obedience. Others suggest that the written rules were ideals, while the lived reality was far messier, filled with compromises no chronicler dared to describe. As with so much of convent life, the surviving accounts give glimpses rather than full pictures, leaving us to imagine the rest. You close your eyes and listen. The silence, once oppressive, now feels strangely comforting, like a blanket woven of nothing but stillness. You notice how your own breath becomes louder in the absence of speech. Each exhale fogs the air, vanishing like incense smoke. Your ears pick up the faintest sounds, the wind keening through the shutters, the slow drip of water thawing from the roof, the creak of timber strained by frost. In such silence, the world itself feels alive, every sound magnified into meaning. And yet, silence was not always a gift. Some nuns found it unbearable, their minds buzzing with unspoken thoughts. You can almost feel the tension of lying awake, words forming silently in your head, prayers turning into questions, questions turning into doubts. Without the comfort of whispered conversation, the night could stretch long and lonely, each hour marked only by the relentless toll of bells. Sleep, if it came, was a fragile mercy, easily broken by cold or restlessness. A curious practice mentioned in certain monastic commentaries was the use of gestures to communicate small needs without breaking silence. A sister who wished to borrow a blanket or indicate discomfort might raise a hand, point, or mimic a simple action. You imagine this secret vocabulary playing out in the dark, hands flickering like shadows to bridge the gap between silence and necessity. It is almost comical, and yet deeply practical, a human solution to a divine command. The longer you remain in this hush, the more you notice how silence reshapes your senses. Smells seem sharper: straw, wool, smoke, and the faint tang of cold stone. Touch becomes louder: the scratch of wool on your skin, the pressure of hard straw beneath your body. Even thoughts grow vivid, as if amplified by the absence of voices. Perhaps this was the real intention of the Great Silence, not simply to forbid chatter, but to heighten awareness, turning every breath and sensation into a form of prayer. Still, the line between holiness and hardship was thin. Imagine a sister unable to sleep, her body aching from fasting, her stomach gnawing with hunger, her bones cold despite every layer. In the silence, she has no outlet, no voice to break her loneliness. She lies still, eyes wide, reciting psalms in her head, waiting for dawn. That patience, that endurance, was itself considered a virtue, a sacrifice offered in secret, known only to God. You lie there with her, in spirit if not in body. The air bites at your face, and the blanket scratches your chin. The hush stretches on, endless, wrapping you tighter than the wool ever could. And though it seems unbearable, you begin to understand why the sisters accepted it. Silence was their crucible, their discipline, their way of sharpening devotion through deprivation. Perhaps in time, you too would come to cherish it. You lie back beneath the rafters and notice your own breath rising like ghostly ribbons in the gloom. Each exhale curls white in the air before dissolving into nothing, a reminder of how bitter the cold has become. The convent is alive with these tiny clouds, each sister's breath a drifting signal of her body's struggle to stay warm. You can almost see them overlapping in the dark, forming a silent fog that hovers above the palates. The air is so icy it feels solid, pressing into your nose, stinging your throat when you inhale. Records from monastic chroniclers suggest that in particularly harsh winters, the temperature inside convent dormitories dipped so low that water left in jugs froze solid by morning. You imagine reaching for a drink in the night only to find the surface crusted with ice, the liquid stiff and unyielding. If water froze indoors, what must the sisters have felt in their thin habits, wrapped in scratchy blankets that barely trapped heat? It makes you shiver even now. Sitting centuries removed, your imagination alone enough to raise goosebumps on your arms. The cold had a way of marking everything. Wax candles hardened so stiff they cracked. Ink froze in the scriptoria. Bread left overnight turned hard as stone. An odd little mention in a set of convent accounts notes that even medicinal salves were useless in January. The ointments congealed to lumps that needed thawing before use. You picture a weary infirmarian rubbing her hands together, breathing on a jar of ointment, trying to soften it enough to soothe a sister's frostbitten skin. Some researchers wonder whether these extreme conditions were common to all convents, or if only those in northern climates endured them. It remains uncertain, since evidence is uneven. A convent in Spain might have enjoyed winters far more forgiving than those in England or Germany. The archaeological remains of buildings offer clues: thicker walls, heavier shutters, smaller windows in colder regions, but they cannot capture the full sensation of lying awake, teeth chattering, each breath painting the air in pale mist. You draw your own blanket tighter, though it offers little relief. The wool scratches your chin, and beneath it, your body curls instinctively into itself, seeking warmth. You imagine the sisters doing the same, their habits wrapped around them like second blankets. Some even kept their veils on through the night, not out of vanity, but necessity. The stiff cloth shielded ears from the draught, muffling the howl of wind sneaking through cracks in the shutters. One medieval sermon delivered to nuns in winter advised them to take comfort in the smoke of their own breath, likening it to incense rising before God. The metaphor is almost poetic, but you can hear the edge of irony too. When your breath itself is visible, comfort is more imagined than real. You try to picture a dormitory full of veiled women, their exhalations mingling in the gloom like incense plumes, each sigh a prayer, each puff of mist a reminder of endurance. And yet, life was not all solemn. A curious anecdote from a Flemish convent tells of sisters who, on the coldest nights, would stamp their feet or clap their hands quickly before settling into bed, as though trying to trick their bodies into warmth. The report scolded them for childishness, but you can imagine the muffled laughter, the brief sparks of mischief breaking the heaviness of the night. Cold has a way of pushing people towards small rebellions, gestures of life against the weight of stillness. You pose, listening. The silence of the great silence still reigns, but now it is filled with subtler sounds. The faint wheeze of a chest burdened with winter illness, the distant creak of wood contracting in the frost, the quiet rustle as a sister shifts to tuck her toes beneath her robes. It feels like the whole room is breathing, each woman's body fighting against the stone chill of the convent itself. The debate among modern historians touches on whether such conditions shortened lifespans. Mortality records show high rates of respiratory illnesses among religious women, but it is difficult to disentangle cold from diet, from fasting, from the limited medical care available. Some suggest the constant exposure to chill may have weakened immune systems over years, while others argue that nuns, bound by routine and prayer, may have endured longer lives precisely because of their regulated existence. The truth, as always, is clouded, much like your own breath in this icy room. You let your head sink into the straw pillow. The straw beneath your cheek feels brittle, stiff, and cold to the touch. You shift, and it crunches faintly, releasing a dusty odor that mingles with the tang of your breath. For a moment, you imagine yourself one of them, eyes closed, toes curled, prayers whispered silently as the frost creeps in. You are not resting so much as waiting, suspended between wakefulness and a fragile sleep. And yet, in that fragility, there is a strange beauty. Each breath becomes an act of survival, each cloud of mist proof that life still endures. The sisters must have felt it too, their very breathing transformed into prayer, their bodies offering persistence as devotion. In the stillness, your own breath joins theirs, curling white in the air, vanishing into the dark. You draw the wool blanket closer, but still the chill cuts through. The cloth is heavy, coarse, and stubborn, its fibers prickling at your skin like nettles. Every movement makes the wool rasp against your arms, leaving behind little trails of irritation. Yet this very robe, the habit you wear by day, now doubles as your night clothes. There are no silken pajamas here, no separate garments meant for rest. What you wore to chapel, you wear to bed. The idea was simple. Why indulge the body when the spirit's work was never finished? Surviving records from monastic rules note that sisters often slept fully clothed, habits and veils still intact. The garments were designed for modesty, but in winter they became armor against the cold. A nun would lie down with her tunic, scapula, wimple, and veil still wrapped tight, her belt perhaps loosened but rarely removed. It spared her the misery of undressing in an icy dormitory, and it meant she was ready to leap from bed at the midnight bell without fumbling for clothes. The layering was both practical and symbolic. Chroniclers mention with a tone of approval that habit served as blankets upon the body and discipline upon the soul. You smile faintly at the phrase. What sounds poetic to them feels like itchy punishment to you. Imagine trying to sleep with woolen cloth clinging to your neck, your ears muffled by stiff veils, your body unable to breathe freely beneath the heavy folds. The habit gave warmth, yes, but it also weighed down every movement, making comfort a rare and fleeting guest. A curious custom emerges in certain visitation notes. Some sisters tucked their hands inside long sleeves and folded them against their chest to preserve warmth. Picture them lying side by side, hands hidden in cloth cocoons, bodies curled like children. It seems almost sweet, an unconscious echo of the body's oldest instinct to shield itself from chill. The records scold this practice as slovenly, yet you can almost hear the muffled giggles as novices tried it anyway, grateful for the brief relief. The question of how many layers a nun wore to bed remains unsettled. Some researchers argue that extra garments, such as cloaks or hoods, were permitted in harsher climates. Others insist the strictest houses allowed only the ordinary habit, no additions, no soft furs. The surviving evidence is contradictory. Inventories sometimes list cloaks among winter allowances, but rules emphasize austerity above all. You are left in the middle ground of imagination, layering and removing cloth in your mind, never sure how much relief the sisters truly allowed themselves. You shift now, tugging the robe tighter. The folds fall heavy over your chest, pressing against you like damp earth. You can almost hear the scratch of wool rubbing against wool as sisters turn in their beds, the sound of cloth rasping in unison like the faint wings of moths. The air grows warmer inside your cocoon, though damp too, your breath caught and trapped beneath the layers. Sleep comes not in comfort but in surrender, when the body finally gives up fighting. One odd note survives from an English convent. The sisters were instructed not to remove their girdles, the rope belt cinching their habits even at night. The reasoning was symbolic restraint, a reminder that discipline does not end with daylight. You imagine lying down with a rope biting faintly at your waist, shifting uncomfortably, knowing that loosening it might bring warmth but also guilt. It is a strange mingling of devotion and discomfort, the body bound in sleep as much as in waking. And yet, despite the rules, you suspect some nuns quietly rebelled. Perhaps one loosened her belt a little more than allowed, or slipped an extra woolen shawl beneath her blanket. Perhaps another pulled her veil down from her ears just enough to let them breathe in the icy air. These small acts of mercy, invisible in the dark, left no mark in the chronicles but must have been common. For what human being, no matter how devout, could resist seeking a scrap of comfort on a freezing night? You feel the habit against your own skin, heavy and rough. It does not welcome you to rest, it cages you there. But in that cage lies the heart of the convent's teaching. By wearing the same garments to bed, the sisters reminded themselves that life was not divided into sacred and ordinary, day and night. Every breath, every moment of discomfort was part of their offering. The robe was not clothing, it was prayer, unbroken, even in the silence of sleep. You let the folds settle around you, the wool prickling, the belt tight at your waist. Your body curls inward, hands tucked into sleeves, ears muffled, breath caught. It is far from comfortable, yet strangely, you feel yourself sinking into the rhythm of it, lulled not by softness but by the sheer inevitability of surrender. This was how they lived, and this was how they slept, bound in cloth, bound in silence, bound in faith. The wool still clings to your body as you imagine rising for a moment, bare feet pressing onto the floor. The shock is immediate, a biting sting that shoots up through your legs as if the stones themselves are knives of ice. The dormitory floor has no mercy. Even in summer, it feels cool and unyielding, but in the depth of winter, it is almost unbearable. You hiss through your teeth, a sound you try to swallow quickly in respect for the great silence. But the cold claims your body with every step. Reports preserved in visitation records describe how nuns were often forbidden to wear shoes or slippers inside their convent halls. Bare feet, they believed, kept one humble, stripped away vanity, and reminded the sisters of their poverty. Walking across stone was not a punishment, it was discipline. Still, you can't help but flinch at the thought of doing it nightly in January. Your own toes curl reflexively, gripping at the idea of warmth that is nowhere to be found. One small but vivid detail comes from a chronicle in Saxony, where a prioress praised her sisters for enduring frostbitten feet as a crown of holy suffering. Imagine toes cracked and white with cold, skin splitting where it pressed against unrelenting stone. Such injuries would have lingered long after the snow melted, proof of devotion etched into flesh. The chronicler called it holy. You, standing barefoot now, can only think of pain. There are whispers of gentler practices too. A curious anecdote mentions that in some convents, novices were allowed to warm their feet by rubbing them quickly with straw before bed. Picture a group of young sisters huddled together, giggling as they briskly swiped straw across their frozen soles, trying to coax a little heat into their skin before the prioress caught them. It is a tender moment of rebellion, laughter spilling into the silence for just a heartbeat. The question of whether nuns universally went barefoot indoors is still unresolved. Some researchers suggest that in colder climates, wooden clogs or felted slippers were permitted, at least for older or infirm sisters. Others insist that the stricter convents never allowed such relief. The truth likely varied by region and by abbess. Archaeological finds of discarded shoes hint at some flexibility, but the texts emphasize austerity. The lived experience, as always, is a patchwork of rule and reality. You walk slowly, trying to ignore the way the stone bites at your flesh. Each step feels like stepping on ice, your weight sinking into its bitter solidity. The chill climbs into your bones until your knees tremble slightly. You glance around the dormitory and see the outlines of sisters curled in their beds, most with their feet tucked tightly into the folds of their habits. Only the most disciplined or the most exhausted let their feet rest bare on the cold surface of their pallets. One description from a convent rulebook in Italy advised sisters to wash their feet before bed, a small ritual of cleanliness. But in winter, that practice could become agony. Water drawn from the well was near freezing, and sisters dipped their feet in with shudders, whispering prayers as the chill numbed their skin. You can almost hear the hiss of breath, the quick withdrawal, the forced surrender as they obeyed the order despite the sting. It is a scene that captures both the devotion and the quiet misery of daily life. You settle back onto your pallet, rubbing your feet together in the straw, trying to coax some warmth. The straw crunches, and a faint, earthy smell rises with it. You tuck your toes beneath the layers of habit, curling tight as a snail in its shell. For a moment, you feel the faintest heat return, only to have it stolen away again by the ever-present drafts. The symbolism of bare feet reached deeper than physical austerity. The rule of Saint Benedict often emphasized humility as being bare before God. To go barefoot was to renounce protection, to feel the world's hardness without buffer, and to offer that discomfort as prayer. Every step on cold stone was a reminder that comfort was fleeting, but faith was eternal. The sisters lived it daily, the floor beneath them transformed into a silent teacher of endurance. You close your eyes and imagine the sound of dozens of bare feet padding across stone at once, soft, quick, almost like whispers brushing against the floor. In the darkness, the movement must have seemed ghostly, pale figures drifting silently, their breath rising in mist, their steps echoing faintly through the cloisters. It is both eerie and tender, a vision of women bound together by silence, cold, and belief. You tuck your feet firmly beneath your blanket now, grateful for even the meager insulation. Your toes still ache, but you know the sisters felt this night after night, year after year. Their bare steps were prayers, their cold souls offerings, their discomfort a bridge between body and spirit. And in that small act, walking barefoot on icy stone, they believed themselves closer to heaven. The silence of the dormitory is thick, but it is not total darkness. In one corner, a single candle flickers, its flame bending and swaying with every draught that slides through the shutters. The light is faint, golden against the endless grey of stone, but in this place even that sliver of warmth feels precious. You watch as the candle guttering throws tall shadows on the wall, shapes that stretch like cloaked figures drifting across the dormitory. Accounts from medieval convents often mention that candles were rationed with care. Wax was costly, reserved for chapel and sacred duties, while tallow candles made of rendered animal fat were cheaper and more common for mundane needs. The difference was easy to tell. Beeswax gave a sweet, clean scent and a steady glow, while tallow smoked heavily, leaving a greasy odor in the air. You imagine the sisters lying in their beds, the smoke prickling their throats, eyes watering slightly as shadows danced above them. The flicker of flame was both comfort and danger. An odd note survives in the records of a northern German convent where a novice accidentally set straw smouldering when she placed a candle too close to her pallet. The fire was stamped out before disaster struck, but the abbess ordered stricter controls, forbidding any flame near bedding. You can picture the panic of that night. Sisters scrambling in silence, beating at straw with bare hands, the smell of singed wool lingering long afterward. Scholars continue to puzzle over how many candles might have been left burning in dormitories. Some argue that most convents preferred total darkness, conserving wax for liturgical use. Others suggest at least one light remained, both for safety and to remind the sisters of Christ as the light of the world. The truth may have shifted over centuries, flickering as unevenly as the candle flames themselves. You move closer to the glow, studying how it pushes shadows into strange angles. The beams of the roof stretch like ribs above you, darkened by smoke. Every so often, the flame sputters as a draft sneaks in, sending shadows jerking across the stone wall. You can almost imagine the sisters lying in their beds, watching these shapes dance, their minds conjuring visions in the dark. For some, it might have been frightening. For others, meditative, the play of light, a silent sermon on the fragility of life. The smell of burning fat hangs faintly in the room, clinging to your hair, settling in the fabric of your habit. The odor is both acrid and oddly comforting, a reminder of kitchens, of hearths, of life outside the convent walls. It mingles with the musty straw and the damp chill of stone, creating a cocktail of scents that defined the convent night. You inhale deeply, and the air scratches your throat, leaving behind a faint bitterness. There are reports from certain convents that sisters were required to take turns tending the night lights. One would wake periodically, trim the wick, and ensure the flame did not die. Imagine the quiet duty of rising in the freezing dark, fumbling with a candle stub, fingers clumsy from cold, while the rest of the dormitory lay bundled in uneasy sleep. That flickering flame was a lifeline, keeping the dark from becoming absolute. And yet, not all dormitories allowed such light. A stricter abbess might insist that darkness was more fitting for humility, that candles tempted vanity by allowing sisters to see themselves or one another too clearly. In such places, the dormitory at night was a cave of blackness, the only illumination coming from the faint shimmer of moonlight through shutters or the white breath of the sisters themselves. The debate lingers even now. Were convent nights dimly golden or utterly black? The evidence does not settle the question. You return your gaze to the candle. Its flame leans forward, then back, a tiny dancer battling the wind. The wax runs in rivulets, hardening into pale ridges down the side. The wick glows red at its tip, a tiny ember holding on. Around it, the shadows grow long, bending across the pallets where sisters curl in silence. You picture one nun staring at the light, whispering prayers into her blanket, letting the flame guide her thoughts toward heaven. Another turns away, eyes closed tightly, wishing only for darkness so her mind can rest. The candle finally steadies, flame upright and strong, though you know it won't last until dawn. By morning, it will be a stub, melted into a puddle of wax hardened against wood. Perhaps a novice will scrape it up and save it, remelting the remnants into another candle. Nothing went to waste in the convent. Even light was recycled. You lie back on your pallet, eyes tracing the shadows on the rafters. The flicker feels hypnotic, drawing your mind into drowsiness. Light and dark mingle above you, swirling gently until they blur together. In that quiet moment, the candle seems less like a tool and more like a companion, the only warm heartbeat in a room otherwise given over to cold stone and silent bodies. You close your eyes, the glow still painted faintly on your lids. The shadows stretch one last time, then vanish into sleep. The stillness doesn't last. At first, you hear it as a whisper, a distant note threading through the silence. Then it grows clearer, the low, steady clang of the convent bell breaking the night wide open. You jolt, though you try not to move too quickly. The stone cold of the air punishes sudden motion. The bell is calling, as it always does, to matins, the midnight office. In the middle of the night, when sleep is thinnest and the cold is deepest, the sisters must rise. Records from medieval liturgical schedules confirm that nuns, like monks, were bound to the canonical hours, rising several times in the night to pray. Matins was the hardest of them all. Imagine lying in scratchy wool on a bed of straw, your body finally beginning to drift toward rest, only to be wrenched awake by that iron voice echoing across stone. No mercy in its sound, just the blunt reminder that prayer mattered more than comfort. You pull your blanket aside, and the cold rushes in. Your breath fogs as you swing your legs out, bare feet striking the icy floor. The pain is immediate, a stab of frost running up your calves. You hear the faint rustle of straw as other sisters stir, the sound of dozens of women shifting at once, groaning quietly in their silence. The great silence forbids speech, but no rule can forbid the sighs of exhaustion. A curious anecdote survives in a visitation account. One novice was found asleep still in bed after the bell for matins, and her punishment was to stand barefoot on the cloister floor during prayers. Picture her trembling in the night, toes numb, her head bowed as the others filed past. The abbess made her a living reminder of vigilance. It is both pitiful and strict, a glimpse of how discipline pierced even the moments of sleep. Historians are divided over how fully the sisters obeyed the midnight summons. Some argue that infirm nuns were excused, resting while the healthier rose. Others suggest attendance was compulsory for all but the gravely ill, with absences recorded and punished. Surviving rules rarely agree, and so you are left to imagine the uncertainty. Did some beds stay filled in the darkness, their owners too frail to rise, or did every pallet empty in obedience to the bell? You rise with them now, shuffling into the corridor. The air there is even colder, a tunnel of frost funneling through the stone. Your habit clings stiff with chill, your fingers numb as you clutch a candle stub for light. The line of sisters moves slowly, their breaths forming a white procession of mist. The floor groans under bare feet, a rhythm of muted thuds keeping time with the tolling bell. One detail preserved in convent statutes was that sisters were not permitted to sit during matins, lest drowsiness overcome them. You imagine yourself swaying in the chapel, knees aching, eyelids heavy, as psalm after psalm is sung. The cold air helps keep you awake, though barely. Every note of chant echoes up into the vaulted dark, the sound haunting, almost otherworldly, in the middle of the night. But there were human failures too. An odd little tale tells of a sister who nodded off during the long chanting, her voice trailing into silence. The prioress, stern but not unkind, rapped her knuckles with a psalter to wake her. You can almost see the scene, the poor nun blinking, cheeks flushed, trying to rejoin the chant as though nothing had happened, while her sisters stifled secret smiles in the shadows. You step into the chapel now. The air is no warmer here, though the presence of so many bodies and the faint light of candles gives a fragile sense of shelter. The sisters stand in rows, veils dark against the flickering glow. Their voices rise in chant, slow and measured, weaving Latin words into the frozen air. The sound is beautiful but heavy, not jubilant but solemn, like the weight of stone turned into song. And then, after an hour or more, the service ends. You shuffle back to the dormitory, body leaden with exhaustion. The bell has ceased its toll, but its echo still rings in your ears. You crawl back to your pallet, straw crunching, blanket scratching, breath fogging. Your toes are numb, your fingers stiff, your head aching with fatigue. You close your eyes, desperate for sleep, knowing it will be short and shallow before the next bell. This routine, repeated night after night, carved itself into the rhythm of convent life. For the sisters, sleep was never whole, never generous. It came in fragments, interrupted by bells, scattered between prayers. To them, it was not deprivation but devotion, a reminder that the body's needs must bend to the soul's service. And yet, lying here with your limbs aching from cold and fatigue, you cannot help but think, what a price they paid for holiness. You return to your pallet, the echo of matins still pulsing faintly in your ears. The dormitory feels colder now, as if the warmth you had coaxed into the straw earlier has been stolen by the night air. Your limbs are heavy, dragging you down, but sleep does not come easily. The body aches, and the mind still hums with fragments of psalms. You collapse into the straw, pulling the scratchy wool higher, your breath curling once more into the dark. Surviving convent regulations suggest that sisters were allotted only a few hours of rest between the night offices. The timing varied, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes less. You imagine the strain of closing your eyes with the knowledge that soon the bell will summon you again. There is no luxury of deep slumber, only shallow dozing, broken and restless, caught between prayer and fatigue. The return to bed is not smooth. You stumble barefoot across the icy floor, climb onto the pallet, and tug the blanket over your head. The straw crunches loudly, startling you with its sharpness. For a moment, you envy the straw itself. It lies still, indifferent to bells or rules, while your body twists, restless, seeking peace it rarely finds. An odd mention in the writings of a Cistercian abbess records that some sisters developed tricks to fall back asleep quickly. One would recite the same psalm verse repeatedly, like a lullaby, until her mind surrendered. Another kept a pebble under her mattress. When she woke for prayer, she removed it, and when she returned, she put it back, the tiny discomfort anchoring her body in habit. These are strange little glimpses of humanity tucked inside rigid devotion. Scholars continue to question whether nuns truly managed the full schedule of broken sleep. Some argue that chronic fatigue must have plagued them, leading to shortened lifespans or constant illness. Others counter that the rhythm, though harsh, created a kind of steady endurance, training bodies to adapt over years. The evidence is inconclusive. Letters complain of exhaustion, yet some convent necrologies record sisters living into their 70s. The truth seems caught between frailty and resilience. You roll onto your side, clutching the blanket closer. The itch of wool stings your cheek, but you ignore it. Your body curls in, knees tight to chest, as if shrinking yourself might shrink the cold. Sleep does not arrive like a friend. It sneaks in like a thief, catching you in moments of stillness. Just as you begin to drift, your neighbor shifts, straw crunches, or someone coughs, and you are awake again. One detail preserved in a visitation report describes how novices often wept quietly after the midnight office, unable to settle back into slumber. Older sisters scolded them, reminding them that discipline required stillness, but the image lingers. Young women, barely more than girls, lying in the cold with tears freezing on their cheeks. It is a reminder that beneath the rules, human frailty was always present, hidden in the shadows. You try to relax, letting the silence press around you. The dormitory is full of tiny sounds, the slow breathing of others, the faint rattle of someone's chest, the rustle of cloth as a sister shifts in her sleep. In the dark, each sound grows louder, a kind of nocturnal chorus that fills the silence without breaking it. You listen, half drowsy, until the noises blur into rhythm, like the tide of the sea washing over your thoughts. There are hints in some manuscripts that Abbess is worried about these moments between sleep and prayer. One stern instruction declares that sisters must sleep in sobriety, guarding the mind from idle wandering. The concern was that half-dreaming thoughts might drift toward temptations or distractions. But you cannot help but think, in this exhaustion, who could control their mind? Sleep itself is rebellion, claiming the body no matter what the rule commands. You turn again, pressing your face into the straw pillow. Dust tickles your nose, making you want to sneeze, though you suppress it to keep the silence. The pillow offers no softness, only lumps and prickles, but at this point your body no longer cares. Fatigue pulls heavier than discomfort. You remember the abbess's words, but they fade, drowned by the weight of drowsiness. And in that fragile moment, you finally slip under. Sleep comes not like a deep pool, but like a thin veil drawn over your mind, fragile, transparent, easily torn by the next toll of the bell. Still, it is sleep, and it is enough. When you next stir, the dormitory is not silent. The wind moans through cracks in the shutters, and somewhere nearby, a faint shuffling interrupts the rhythm of sleep. You open your eyes and catch the glimmer of a candle stub, shielded carefully by a cupped hand. A sister is moving, quietly, with the deliberation of someone performing a forbidden act. She disappears behind a partition, and you realize there were always little secrets carried through these winters, small tricks passed down to help endure what the rules never softened. Surviving notes in convent records hint at these odd remedies. Some sisters swore by pressing a hot stone heated earlier at the kitchen hearth into their straw bedding before the final prayers of the evening. By the time they returned, the warmth lingered just long enough to take the edge off the frozen mattress. Others tucked bottles filled with warm water under their veils or robes, a medieval cousin to the hot water bottle you might keep on your shelf today. You can almost see them huddled in corners, hiding the glow of coals, sharing whispered advice on how best to cheat the cold. Another unusual practice is mentioned in the margins of a visitation account. A prioress discovered that her sisters were smuggling small animals, cats most often, but sometimes even rabbits into the dormitories to use as living heaters. Picture a nun curled on her pallet, a cat purring against her chest, its body radiating warmth through her robes. The chronicler disapproved, but you cannot help but smile at the thought. In the middle of January, with frost crawling down the walls, A warm creature in your arms must have felt like a blessing no rule could erase. Historians remain divided on how widespread these tricks were. Some argue they were isolated anecdotes, curiosities preserved precisely because they were unusual. Others believe they were far more common, unrecorded only because they were too ordinary to note. After all, when the human body is pushed to its limits, ingenuity is inevitable. Whether cat, stone, or flask of warm water, sisters surely sought whatever scraps of comfort they could, even if the chronicles stay silent. You shift on your straw, imagining tucking a smooth stone wrapped in cloth against your belly, feeling its heat spread briefly before fading. The comfort is fleeting, but in such nights, fleeting warmth is enough. You picture the faint glow of coals carried in iron pans, carefully shielded so the abbess would not see. Perhaps she knew and chose to look away. Or perhaps she scolded sternly, warning that such indulgence endangered the soul. Either way, the sisters continued, for survival often requires disobedience dressed as devotion. One curious remedy, preserved in a 15th century German manual, advised nuns to rub goose fat on their feet before bed, claiming it sealed in heat. Imagine the smell lingering in the dormitory, pungent and oily, mingling with straw and wool. It must have been unpleasant, yet desperation makes the strange seem practical. You chuckle softly, then hush yourself. The thought of dozens of veiled women all reeking faintly of goose fat is comical, but also strangely moving. It shows the lengths to which they would go for the chance of rest. You glance around the dormitory again, imagining the hidden diversity of strategies. One sister pulls her veil tighter, tucking her chin deep inside. Another layers, two habits, risking disapproval. Another quietly shifts closer to her neighbor, their shoulders almost touching for shared warmth. These are acts of survival disguised as discipline. Each body finds its own way to resist the winter night. Researchers who study convent architecture note that some dormitories contained hearths, though whether they were lit regularly remains uncertain. A hearth without wood is as cold as stone, and wood was expensive. Some argue that these hearths served more for ritual than comfort, symbols of light in darkness. Others suggest that, at least in wealthier convents, they were used sparingly on the worst nights. The debate continues, flickering like a candle flame in the draughty hall of history. You imagine the sisters who had no hearth, no mercy. They curled tight, relied on tricks, whispered secrets of warmth like contraband knowledge. You feel your own body responding to their ingenuity. You tuck your hands deeper into your sleeves, curl your toes, imagine the weight of a cat against your chest, purring. The air is still sharp, but in your mind you almost feel warm. And this, perhaps, is the most striking truth. Survival here was not found in grand gestures, but in small, human acts. A hidden ember, a smuggled cat, a stone wrapped in cloth. Each one a reminder that even behind the strict walls of devotion, the sisters remained deeply, insistently human. The night presses on, and you notice the dormitory shutters rattle faintly. Wind slips through the smallest of cracks, whistling like a voice that doesn't belong. You glance at the window. No glass shields the room, only rough planks, fitted unevenly, with gaps too narrow to see through yet wide enough to let the winter in. The draught sneaks across the floor like an invisible river, brushing your skin with fingers of ice. Contemporary building surveys reveal that most convents of the Middle Ages lacked glazed windows. Glass was costly, reserved for cathedrals or wealthy households. Here, shutters alone stood between the sisters and the elements. Even when closed, the wood warped, shrank, and split over time, leaving openings where the air seeped in. You can almost hear the wind probing every seam, searching for ways to remind the sisters that comfort was not part of their vows. The air that leaks through is sharp, carrying with it the smell of snow and earth. In your mind, you see flakes catching in the cracks, tiny white sparks that melt into droplets, dampening the wood. Sometimes frost grew along the edges, tracing delicate patterns across the planks. Imagine waking to find ice ferns blooming inside your room, nature claiming the walls with its silent artistry. It is beautiful and cruel at once, a reminder of the season's power. An unusual note in a 14th century visitation report describes how some nuns stuffed wool, straw, or even rags into the shutter gaps. The abbess reprimanded them, saying such actions betrayed weakness. Yet you can picture it clearly. Sisters, weary of the endless draught, jamming bits of cloth into cracks with furtive determination. It was an act of defiance, but also of common sense. What use is devotion if your toes are frozen to numbness? The scholarly debate lingers around whether convent architecture was deliberately austere or simply limited by resources. Some argue that builders intentionally avoided insulation, fearing comfort might lead to idleness. Others believe the lack of glass and ceiling was merely economic, too costly for communities bound by vows of poverty. Archaeological remains show a spectrum. Some convents clearly had sophisticated stonework and tightly fitted shutters, while others were little more than barns with prayer rooms. The evidence, like the wind, never quite settles. You huddle into your blanket, but the draft finds you anyway. It snakes beneath the wool, crawling across your ankles, threading up your back. You pull the folds tighter, curl tighter, but the air refuses to leave. You realize how relentless such nights must have been. The cold not only outside the walls, but inside, whispering constantly through cracks, reminding you that you can never quite escape. One curious anecdote tells of sisters hanging their spare habits over the shutters to block drafts. It was not an official allowance, but a desperate improvisation. The image is almost comic robes flapping like banners over wooden slats, but effective enough to dull the sting. Perhaps the abbess scolded them in the morning. Perhaps she turned a blind eye. Rules bend quietly when frost takes hold. The candlelight catches the shutter now, showing faint lines of frost forming along the edges. They glitter like tiny stars, shimmering in the weak glow. You imagine touching them, the sting sharp against your fingertips, the ice melting instantly into water that chills your skin further. For the sisters, this was not an occasional inconvenience, but a daily companion each winter. A relentless guest they never invited but always endured. And still, in the chronicles, there is little complaint. Some writings even praise the drafts as purifiers of the soul, likening the wind's chill to God's testing breath. The poetic image rings hollow when your own body shivers. But perhaps that was the point. The discomfort itself was a lesson, teaching patience, humility, and surrender. You listen now to the draft as though it were a voice. It hums, sighs, moans against the shutters, rising and falling like chant. The sisters must have grown accustomed to it, their ears tuning it out as one more element of the night. Perhaps in time, the sound even became comforting, a reminder that the world outside still moved, that beyond the walls, creation itself kept vigil. You lie still, the straw crunching beneath you, blanket pulled to your chin. The draft continues, insistent, sneaking in no matter how tightly you curl. You close your eyes and let it brush across your face, imagining yourself one of them, resigned, patient, and strangely calm. The wind may have entered the convent, but it never broke their resolve. The draft still lingers at your ankles, but then you notice something softer in the shadows, a faint rustle, a quiet purr, a sound far too gentle to be human. You peer toward the pallet beside you, and catch sight of movement, a small shape curling against the folds of a nun's habit. A cat. Its body, rounded and warm, shifts slightly, pressing closer to the sleeping sister. Its steady purring hums like a lullaby against the silence. Though convent rules often forbade animals inside dormitories, scattered accounts suggest otherwise. Household cats were kept to chase mice in storerooms and kitchens, and sometimes they found their way into the beds of weary sisters. A visitation record from Flanders scolds one community for allowing creatures of the barn into sacred spaces, yet the reprimand itself proves it happened. You smile at the thought. Rules on parchment, cats on pallets, the cold defeated by purring paws. Imagine the scene: a novice, shivering, slipping her arms around a smuggled cat, feeling its fur vibrate against her skin. The warmth seeps into her bones, not enough to erase the cold entirely, but enough to soften it. Perhaps she whispers a prayer of thanks not only to God, but to the little beast in her arms. Survival, after all, often arrives in the form of companionship. One curious note even mentions rabbits, raised in cloister gardens for food but sometimes kept longer as warming beasts. A nun might cradle one under her robe at night, its twitching nose brushing her chin. Rabbits are fragile, but their warmth is real, and in the harshest winters, fragility could be forgiven. The chronicler who recorded this detail did so with obvious disapproval, yet he preserved the memory nonetheless. The question of how tolerated these practices were remains uncertain. Some scholars believe that abbesses turned a blind eye to such small rebellions, recognizing that survival required bending rules. Others argue that such indulgences were rare, exceptions remembered precisely because they were scandalous. The evidence is ambiguous, but the humanity behind it is clear. Even the most devout sought warmth in ways that rules could not provide. You imagine lying down now with a cat tucked beneath your chin. Its fur is thick, its body a steady furnace. Your hands stroke it gently, fingers sinking into softness that contrasts sharply with the rough wool of your blanket. Its smell is faintly earthy, a reminder of the garden, of sunlit walls, of life beyond the stone. For a moment, you are not simply enduring the night, you are comforted by it. The dormitory itself must have been alive with such hidden moments. A faint scratch of claws against straw, a whiskered face peeking from under robes, a tail flicking in the dark. Perhaps one sister sneezed from fur tickling her nose. Another suppressed a laugh as her neighbor's cat wriggled free and prowled the aisles. These tiny disruptions, though forbidden, must have bound the sisters together in quiet camaraderie. Rules are sharp, but shared secrets soften their edges. A rare anecdote describes an abbess who scolded her community for letting cats distract the mind from Christ. Yet she admitted in the same letter that the mice were fewer, the straw lasted longer, and the bread stores stayed safe. Perhaps she recognized that even disobedience could serve the greater order. Or perhaps she simply knew that cats were harder to expel than to endure. You listen now, and imagine the symphony of a convent night not only as breaths and rustling habits, but as the softer chorus of animals. A dog shifting by the hearth, a cat purring beneath blankets, perhaps even a rabbit kicking against straw. The sounds blend with the human ones, forming a harmony of survival, women and creatures enduring the winter together. And in that image lies something profound. The convent, for all its rules and severity, was still part of nature. Animals slipped across its boundaries, reminding the sisters that the world outside could not be entirely shut away. Their warmth, their presence, their companionship, these were gifts of creation, smuggled into a life that sought to renounce the world but could never escape it fully. You close your eyes and picture yourself stroking the cat's fur, feeling its warmth sink into you. The cold still lurks, but it no longer feels unbearable. For tonight, survival has a heartbeat, soft pause, and a purr. The faint purring drifts into silence, and soon another sound replaces it, a low cough, wet and rattling, from somewhere at the far end of the dormitory. You turn your head, and in the dim light you notice a doorway ajar, beyond which a weaker glow beckons. That is the infirmary, the small chamber where sick sisters were tended during the long, brutal nights of winter. You rise quietly, padding barefoot across the stone, and step into that other world within the convent. The air inside is heavier, carrying the scent of herbs, tallow, and something more bitter illness. A small brazier glows faintly in the corner, not enough to chase away the cold, but warmer than the dormitory by a breath. Along the walls, pallets are arranged in a line, each holding a figure wrapped tightly in wool. Their faces are pale, gaunt, lips chapped by frost. Some shift and murmur in restless fever dreams. Others lie still, their breaths shallow, rising in faint clouds. Contemporary medical accounts from convents suggest that infirmaries were tended with remarkable care, often staffed by sisters skilled in herbcraft. These women brewed syrups of honey and thyme, steeped valerian root for sleep, and mixed pungent poultices to rub onto aching chests. You can almost smell it now, sharp rosemary mingled with mint, sage smoke lingering in the rafters. The aroma both comforts and suffocates, pressing into your nose as though insisting that healing must be inhaled. An unusual report from a French convent records that onions, roasted over the fire, were sometimes placed in a sick room to draw out the poison of bad air. Imagine the odd sight: onions blackening on coals, their scent filling the chamber, while sisters whispered prayers over the patient. Did it work? Probably not. But the act itself gave a sense of control, a ritual against the chaos of sickness. Scholars continue to debate whether convent infirmaries offered better care than the outside world. Some argue that access to herbs, steady routines, and communal support gave nuns an advantage. Others counter that the very austerity of convent life, cold, fasting, thin bedding made recovery difficult, if not impossible. Mortality records show both long-lived nuns and many deaths in youth. The evidence is contradictory, leaving us with a puzzle. Were convent infirmaries havens of healing, or sanctuaries of resignation? You move closer to one pallet, where an elderly sister lies with her eyes half shut. Her breath rattles, but she clasps a wooden crucifix in her hand, lips moving faintly in prayer. A younger nun sits beside her, gently rubbing her hands with a cloth warmed by the brazier. The gesture is tender, though her own hands are red and cracked from the cold. She blows on the elder's fingers, then tucks them back under the blanket. It is not medicine, but love, simple, necessary, more powerful than any herb. The room is filled with such quiet acts. One sister pours broth from a clay cup into another's mouth, careful not to spill. Another adjusts a pillow, though the straw inside crunches too loudly for rest. You hear a whisper of psalm verses, spoken softly by the healthy over the sick. The words are muffled by wool, but their cadence is steady, like waves against the shore. And yet, the infirmary was also a place of vigil. Death was common in winter, when cold and hunger compounded illness. A chronicle from a German house mentions a week where 5 sisters perished within days of each other, their names recorded in the necrology with simple notes. You imagine the atmosphere here during such nights: fear, sorrow, but also acceptance. Each death was seen not as defeat but as passage, the sister finally freed from the cold that plagued her earthly nights. One odd mention in a set of English records states that candles burned continuously in infirmaries, even when they did not in dormitories. The reason was both practical and spiritual. Practical, to guide attendants in the dark. Spiritual, to signify that Christ's light did not abandon the weak. The glow must have made the room feel almost sacred, even as bodies shivered beneath thin blankets. You breathe in deeply, the mingled scents of herbs and smoke filling your chest. The infirmary is not a place of rest for the healthy, but of watchfulness, compassion, and endurance. The sisters who served here gave their nights as freely as their days, sacrificing their own sleep to sit beside the ill. You feel the heaviness of their devotion, a burden carried without complaint. Stepping back toward the dormitory, you realize how fragile survival was. A draft in the shutters, a cough in the night, a winter too long, any of these could push a body beyond its limits. Yet the infirmary stands as proof that even within walls of austerity, the convent sheltered moments of care, where warmth was not found in stone or wool but in human presence. You lie down again on your pallet, the sound of coughing still echoing faintly in your ears. The infirmary door closes, but its memory stays with you. Sleep here was never just sleep. It was a balance between fragility and resilience, illness and endurance, solitude and solidarity. In those winter nights, the convent carried both suffering and solace, braided together like candlelight and shadow. You wake again, not to the bell this time, but to a gnawing ache in your stomach. It is not sharp like pain, but steady and hollow, the kind of hunger that grows louder in the silence of night. You remember the evening meal, thin gruel, a piece of dark bread, perhaps a spoonful of beans if the season was kind. It was not enough to fill you, only enough to remind your body what food once felt like. And now, as you lie in the cold, the emptiness joins the chill, conspiring to keep you awake. Monastic rules across Europe emphasized simplicity in food. Surviving dietary accounts show that nuns ate little meat, often none at all, except in times of illness. Meals were built from bread, porridge, legumes, and vegetables with fish on certain days. In winter, however, vegetables vanished, and the diet narrowed to gruel and preserved goods. Imagine the sisters ladling steaming, watery broth into bowls at supper, sipping it slowly to trick themselves into feeling full. Their stomachs must have rumbled long after, echoing as loudly as any bell. A curious note survives in a 14th century convent record. Some sisters secretly soaked stale bread in hot water before bed, pretending it was a second meal. The practice was forbidden, but the detail lingers in the margins of the manuscript as though written by a sympathetic hand. You can almost taste it now, soggy bread, bland and heavy, but a comfort when the body begged for more than prayer. Modern historians remain divided over how malnutrition affected convent life. Some argue that the constant semi-fasting weakened the nuns, making them more vulnerable to illness. Others suggest that the discipline built a strange endurance, training their bodies to survive on less. Necrologies again complicate the picture. Many nuns died young, but many others lived long into their 60s or 70s. The truth seems hidden in the mixture of faith, genetics, and sheer willpower. You shift on your straw mattress, pulling the blanket closer, but hunger gnaws no matter how tightly you curl. The emptiness makes the cold sharper, every draught more bitter. You imagine dozens of women lying in the same state, bellies hollow, trying to distract themselves with prayer. Perhaps one recited psalms until sleep overtook her. Another might have whispered Ave Marias under her breath, each word a stone laid over the pit in her stomach. For some, it may have worked. For others, it only reminded them of how long until the next thin meal. The sound of fasting was not silence. It was the growl of bellies in the dark. Picture the dormitory filled with muffled rumblings, each one a reminder that devotion demanded not only silence of the tongue but hunger of the body. Chroniclers occasionally remarked on these concerts of the stomach with surprising frankness. One wrote, with a note of dry humor, that the bellies of the sisters sang louder than their lips. You cannot help but smile at the image, though you know it came at real cost. One odd remedy mentioned in a convent rule advised chewing dried herbs or twigs at night to trick the mouth into feeling occupied. Imagine biting into a sprig of dried mint, the flavor faint but distracting, as if taste itself might soothe hunger. Other sisters, so the records suggest, clutched rosaries or small wooden crosses while lying awake, as if to redirect the body's craving into the hands of faith. You wonder how many sisters, lying awake, thought of their childhood homes, kitchens with bread ovens, hearths warm with stew, families sharing meals. Such memories must have returned most vividly in winter, when the convent's austerity pressed hardest. Some may have dreamed of roasted meats or honey cakes, only to wake to porridge once more. In those dreams, hunger became not only physical but emotional, the loss of family comforts mingling with bodily need. A debate persists among scholars about whether abbesses ever relaxed food rules during the harshest seasons. Some records show allowances extra bread during Lent in especially cold years, or fish granted outside the usual calendar. Others insist that rules were ironclad, broken only at the risk of censure. Perhaps, like so much in convent life, it depended on the abbess herself. Stern leaders hardened their sisters with deprivation, while merciful ones bent the law in silence. You press your hand against your stomach, the hollow ache refusing to ease. Your breath curls in the air, and you realize that in this life, hunger was not an interruption of sleep, it was part of it. Every night, cold and hunger mingled, making rest fragile and restless. The sisters did not fight these conditions with feasts or fires. They endured them, body bent beneath faith, finding prayer where others would have found complaint. And so you curl tighter, blankets scratching your skin, stomach empty, breath fogging, the night stretching endlessly. The hunger does not go away, but your body begins to dull it, slipping into uneasy drowsiness. Perhaps this is how they survived, not by conquering hunger, but by learning to drift into sleep despite it. When at last your body loosens into sleep, it is only for a while. You stir again, this time because the air itself has shifted. The walls glimmer faintly in the moonlight, seeping through cracks, and on the rough stone you see a thin sheen frost. Your breath catches. The very walls of the dormitory are glazed with ice, as if the night has painted them in crystal. Each exhale adds to the white film, freezing into delicate webs that creep outward with every passing hour. Reports from Northern European convents describe this exact phenomenon. Walls inside dormitories sparkling with frost, windows frozen shut, floors slippery with condensation hardened by cold. Archaeological studies of preserved convent ruins even show frost damage on the interiors of stone blocks, proof that winters crept indoors as surely as they did out. Imagine lying in a bed where your own breath condensed and froze above your head, so that by dawn the walls gleamed like mirrors of glass. The sight is both beautiful and cruel. The frost catches what little light there is, refracting it into ghostly gleams across the rafters. For a moment it feels almost magical, as if the convent has turned into a palace of ice. But then you feel the sting on your skin, the numbness in your fingers, the way each inhalation cuts like shards. Beauty here is a reminder of suffering, not a gift. A curious anecdote from a convent chronicle in England describes sisters waking to find their veils stiff with frost, the cloth frozen into shapes that held until the morning fire thawed them. You can almost picture them tugging stiff fabric from their faces, laughing weakly through their chattering teeth, grateful at least for the humor in their hardship. Laughter, even in such conditions, was a kind of rebellion against despair. Scholars continue to puzzle over how the sisters endured repeated winters under such conditions. Some argue that over time, the body acclimated, the mind hardening itself as much as the flesh. Others point to higher mortality in colder regions, where repeated seasons of frost slowly wore down even the strongest. The debate circles endlessly, leaving you to feel the truth in your bones. No body escapes cold unscathed. You press your palm against the wall now. The frost burns instantly, biting your skin with its chill. You jerk back, shaking your hand, and the fine crystals fall like snowflakes onto the floor. The sound is faint, a fragile crackle that echoes louder than it should in the silence. You imagine nuns waking to similar sensations, walls shedding ice onto their blankets, tiny flakes falling onto their cheeks as they slept. The damp that accompanied the frost was often worse. One letter preserved from a 15th century abbess complains that the bedding grew wet as though the walls themselves wept. Moisture seeped into straw mattresses, making them heavy, clammy, and foul-smelling. Once wet, straw rotted quickly, releasing a sour odor that clung to robes and hair. You shift uncomfortably at the thought, picturing yourself lying down on damp bedding, the chill climbing through you with every breath. One odd little solution mentioned in a German visitation was the practice of scattering ashes beneath the pallets. Ash was believed to absorb moisture, keeping straw dry a little longer. Imagine novices carrying buckets of ash from the hearth, sprinkling it across the dormitory floor, turning the room into a grey dust cloud just so the straw might stay crisp. The trick was imperfect, but it speaks to human creativity, bending even fire's remains to battle winter. The frost on the walls creeps higher as the night passes. Moonlight glances off it, throwing a silver glow that makes the dormitory look like a cave carved from ice. The sisters, curled in their pallets, become shapes half buried in frost, their breath rising and freezing around them. You feel the weight of that image, the convent not only sheltering them from the world, but sealing them into winter's embrace. And yet, they stayed, year after year, through winters as sharp as blades, they endured. The frost that threatened them was also a teacher. It stripped life down to the barest essentials, leaving only faith, community, and endurance. The walls weep with ice, but the sisters answer with prayer. The bedding rots with damp, but they replace it with fresh straw, shoulders squared. Their survival is not triumphal, it is quiet, stubborn, and relentless. You roll back onto your straw, pulling the blanket tighter. The frost still glimmers on the wall, catching the faint light of the moon. You close your eyes, knowing that when morning comes, the shimmer will melt into dampness, staining the stones, dripping onto the floor. But for now, it is winter's artwork, fragile and fleeting, painted on the walls of devotion. The frost still clings to the walls when another sound rises through the dormitory, the toll of a bell, low and insistent, vibrating against the stones. It is the call to Lauds, the dawn prayer, striking just as the faintest light creeps across the horizon. You open your eyes reluctantly, body heavy with fatigue, and feel the familiar sting of cold sweep over you once more. There is no luxury of sleeping in the rhythm of devotion allows no compromise. Documents from monastic rulebooks confirm that Lauds was often rung at daybreak, marking the hour when the first light met the earth. For nuns, this meant sleep broken again, no matter how deep or shallow. They rose in darkness during winter, long before the sun actually warmed the horizon. The bell did not merely signal prayer, it announced that the night's discomfort was only paused, never truly ended. You push the blanket away and swing your feet down. The floor is still icy, the stone unrelenting, and you hiss through your teeth as the cold claims your toes. Around you, other sisters stir, pulling veils back into place, straightening their habits, whispering a quick, silent prayer before rising. The silence of the great silence is lifted now, but words are still sparse. The bell's echo seems to linger longer than it should, as if each toll hangs frozen in the frigid air. Chroniclers often noted how groggy and stiff the sisters were at dawn, their voices hoarse as they began to chant psalms. Imagine the sound. Dozens of women, half asleep, their breath fogging in clouds, chanting in low, wavering tones. The music of Lauds was never jubilant in winter. It was heavy, solemn, a murmur more than a song. The devotion was real, but so was the exhaustion etched into every note. An odd report from a convent in Normandy mentions that some sisters tried to keep warm during Lauds by swaying side to side, their bodies moving in rhythm with the chant. To the observer, it must have looked like devotion turned to dance, though the intention was purely survival. The abbess, unimpressed, forbade it, saying such motion bordered on distraction. You cannot help but imagine novices swaying discreetly anyway, hoping the small movement might keep their fingers from stiffening. The scholarly debate continues about whether the constant interruptions of sleep harmed more than they helped. Some argue that broken rest weakened the sisters, dulling their senses and damaging their health. Others suggest the rhythm itself, once ingrained, created a resilience, training the body to adapt. Modern sleep science leans toward the first explanation, but the chronicles suggest a more complex truth. The sisters endured, not because it was healthy, but because it was required. You shuffle into the chapel with them now. The air inside is just as cold, though candles glow along the altar, casting halos of light onto the walls. The sisters form their rows, veils swaying faintly as they bow their heads. The chant begins, slow and measured, filling the stone space with sound. It is haunting at this hour, a mixture of human frailty and divine yearning. The voices do not soar. They tremble, they murmur, they endure. The smell of wax drifts faintly, sweeter than tallow, though it cannot mask the damp odor of wool and straw clinging to the sisters' garments. The sound of shivering is muffled but present, little gasps caught between psalm verses. You feel the weight of it. Prayer layered over exhaustion, faith layered over frost. It is both impressive and heartbreaking. Devotion carved from discomfort. One unusual chronicle from a Spanish convent records that during particularly harsh winters, Lauds was sometimes shortened by half. The abbess wrote that, The Lord hears even brief prayers when offered with cold hearts and colder hands. This practical mercy seems rare, yet it shows that even within rigid rules, compassion occasionally flickered like a candle in draught. When Lord's ends, you file out again with the sisters, the faintest glow of dawn finally touching the sky. The cold has not eased, but the rhythm of the day begins regardless. Work awaits. Gardens, kitchens, scriptoria. The sisters step forward into it, shoulders squared, habits swaying, their fatigue hidden beneath obedience. And as you follow them, you realize the night has not given rest. It has given something else, a lesson in resilience, carved into every breath of cold, every break of sleep, every echo of the bell. The first light creeps across the convent walls, but instead of relief, you feel the weight of exhaustion settling deeper. The sisters, though weary, move immediately into their daily rhythm. The bell has ended, Lords, but now the ordinary labours begin. You stumble out of the dormitory into the cloister walk, your breath rising in pale clouds as you brace for the long hours ahead. Sleep lingers in your body like a heavy cloak, but duty pulls you forward. Records from visitation reports and convent statutes often stress that no time was to be wasted after dawn prayers. Sisters moved directly into tasks, milking animals if the convent had them, fetching water from wells, sweeping cloisters, preparing bread, or tending fires in the kitchen. Imagine doing this after barely 4 hours of broken sleep, your limbs trembling with both cold and fatigue. It is not rest that sustains you now, but sheer discipline. You glance at the sisters beside you. Their faces are pale, lined with fatigue even in youth, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep, lips cracked from the cold. Yet none complain. They lower their heads and carry on, their obedience making silence louder than words. The rule taught them that the body was a servant to the soul, and the soul to God. Complaints would only dishonor that order. A curious anecdote survives in the chronicle of a 15th century convent, where one novice collapsed while carrying water after Lauds. The sisters rushed to help her, though the abbess scolded her later for weakness of spirit. Still, the record notes that she was given broth and extra rest that evening. Even in the strictest houses, mercy sometimes slipped through the cracks, like sunlight finding its way into a shuttered cell. Historians continue to argue over how effective these routines were in sustaining convent life. Some see them as practical training in endurance, instilling a rhythm that hardened the body. Others see them as cruel, breaking women down until only submission remained. The evidence is split. Letters of complaint sit alongside hymns of joy, leaving us unsure whether weariness was embraced willingly or merely endured. You step into the cloister garden now. Frost still clings to the hedges, sparkling faintly in the dawn. The ground is hard, tools bite shallow into the earth, but work must be done regardless. The sisters bend to their tasks, veils brushing the frost as they gather herbs or clear paths. The cold air burns your lungs with every breath, but you continue, driven by routine as much as necessity. One unusual record describes nuns warming their hands over the breath of cows in winter, leaning close to the animals in the barns before returning to work. The chronicler writes of it with disapproval, but you cannot help but imagine the relief. A soft muzzle steaming warm air, a momentary shelter from frost. The sisters adapted however they could, their ingenuity shining through where rules remained rigid. By mid-morning, the fatigue deepens. You catch yourself swaying slightly as you carry water, your body begging for sleep it cannot have. You glance at the others. Some suppress yawns, others blink slowly as though their eyes are weighed with stones, and yet the rhythm of prayer and labour holds firm. The bell will ring again for prime, then terce, each hour demanding voice and presence, regardless of how much rest the night withheld. Scholars note that this cycle, little sleep, constant work, fasting was not unique to nuns. Monks endured similar schedules, yet nuns often faced harsher conditions because their convents had fewer resources. Wealthy abbeys might have had thicker walls or better rations, but most women lived in modest houses with limited means. Their survival was not guaranteed by comfort, but by persistence. You picture the day unfolding, every task coloured by the night before. Straw mattresses still clinging with damp, bellies still hollow from thin supper, toes still raw from icy floors. And yet, through it all, prayer stitched the hours together, turning exhaustion into liturgy. The sisters did not measure their nights by rest, but by how faithfully they rose to answer the bell. As you finish your task in the garden, you pause for a moment and look back at the dormitory roof. Smoke curls faintly from a kitchen chimney, but none from the sleeping quarters. The memory of frost-glazed walls, straw-filled pallets, and restless breathing lingers with you. You understand that the night never truly ends here. It follows the sisters into the day, carried in their bodies, their heavy steps, their quiet endurance. And still, they continue. Their faith does not banish fatigue, it simply carries it. In that, perhaps, lies the real strength of their devotion. The garden, so stark beneath its veil of frost, eventually gives way to a different kind of silence. You step along the cloister path, the rhythm of your breath visible in the cold air, and enter once more into the enclosed walkways where the sisters spend their hours between tasks and prayers. Here, the winter has its own voice. The cloister arches trap the wind, sending it whistling low like a chant without words. Beneath your feet, the flagstones are slick with thin ice, glimmering faintly under the grey morning light. Descriptions from medieval convent chronicles often emphasize the importance of the cloister gardens, not merely for labour, but for meditation. Even in winter, the sisters walked here, their heads bowed, their hands hidden in their sleeves. Imagine them tracing the frosted paths, beads of their rosaries clicking softly, their breaths puffing white into the air. The garden, though bare, was a place where the rhythm of devotion continued unbroken. And yet, the garden was no refuge from the cold. Surviving accounts mention that snow often piled against the cloister walls, drifting in through open arches, blanketing paths in white. The sisters cleared it with wooden shovels, their veils whipped by wind, their fingers numbed. It was said that some abbesses encouraged this clearing as penance, turning every act of labour into spiritual exercise. You picture novices bent low, scraping ice from stones while murmuring prayers, their cheeks flushed red by the chill. One curious anecdote from a visitation record in Burgundy describes how the sisters sometimes etched simple patterns in frost with their walking sticks, circles, crosses, even crude flowers, tiny rebellions of art scratched against the severity of winter. The report disapproved, of course, but the image lingers. A bare cloister suddenly alive with frost, drawings, fleeting masterpieces erased by the next wind. Scholars still question how much time the nuns truly spent in the cloister during harsh winters. Some argue that the cold forced them indoors, limiting outdoor walks. Others suggest the discipline of daily movement was enforced regardless of weather to maintain order and health. Archaeological studies of cloisters reveal worn flagstones, smoothed by centuries of steps, evidence that these paths were walked even when snow made them treacherous. The question remains, but the stones themselves whisper of endless footsteps in every season. You pause at a corner of the garden where herbs once grew in warmer months. Now the plots lie barren, soil hard with frost. A faint scent of sage and lavender lingers, dried stalks releasing their perfume when crushed underfoot. For the sisters, these gardens were more than food. They were medicine, fragrance, reminders of summer. Even stripped bare in winter, they held memory, a promise that warmth would return. The sound of the bell carries faintly across the garden, summoning the sisters again. You watch them shuffle along the cloister, habits brushing the frost, their breaths rising like smoke from a line of chimneys. Their movements are slow but steady, exhaustion dulled into obedience. Some clutch their rosaries, others simply bow their heads, their silence broken only by the crunch of ice beneath their feet. An unusual description from a 15th-century German manuscript notes that birds often roosted in cloister gardens during winter, their songs piercing the silence. The chronicler remarked that, The sparrows sing the psalms. When our lips grow too numb, you can almost hear it now, a small bird calling brightly, its voice echoing strangely against stone, reminding the sisters that creation itself still prayed. But the garden was also a reminder of the world beyond the walls. Through the cloister arches, you glimpse the grey sky, the bare branches of trees beyond the convent's enclosure. The outside world feels close and distant at once. Perhaps some sisters longed for the freedom of those trees, while others found comfort in their barrenness, seeing in them a reflection of their own chosen austerity. You walk the path slowly, your feet sliding slightly on the frosted stones. The cold gnaws at your toes, but the rhythm of walking warms you faintly. You realize this must have been the secret. To keep moving, even when exhaustion tempted you to stillness. To pause too long in winter was to let the cold claim you. Movement, however small, was survival disguised as devotion. You return at last to the dormitory door, glancing once more at the cloister garden behind you. Frost clings to every branch, every stone, every arch, as if the world itself has been baptized in winter. The sisters file past you, veils heavy with dew, their breaths still rising in pale clouds. The garden will remain barren until spring, but its paths will not stay empty. Every night, every day, through cold and hunger, their footsteps will etch devotion into stone. The frost on the cloister paths fades behind you as you step into another chamber, the scriptorium. Here the air is as frigid as the dormitory, but the silence is sharpened by the scratching of quills. Sisters hunch over wooden desks, their fingers stiff with cold, dipping pens into ink that thickens sluggishly in the chill. The smell of parchment animal skin, stretched and scraped, mixes with the faint tang of smoke from a candle stub that sputters on the long table. Surviving accounts from medieval convents reveal that winter made the work of writing nearly impossible. Ink froze in inkwells, refusing to flow, and quills snapped more easily when pressed against stiff parchment. You imagine the frustration of a sister trying to form elegant script while her hands trembled with cold, blotting the page with clumsy lines. For women tasked with preserving sacred texts, winter was as much an enemy of knowledge as of comfort. A curious note from a chronicle in Saxony describes how nuns warmed their ink by placing small pots near coals, rotating them carefully so they didn't dry out. Others are said to have breathed onto the parchment itself, their mist softening the surface before writing. You can almost picture a row of sisters leaning forward, exhaling over their work, trying to coax cooperation from their materials before the frost claimed them again. The debate among historians continues about how much writing was realistically accomplished in the coldest months. Some argue that scriptorium work slowed drastically during winter, while others insist that discipline drove them to continue regardless, their manuscripts bearing witness in wobbly script and uneven lines. Indeed, some illuminated manuscripts do show shakier letters in winter-dated colophons, hinting at frozen fingers struggling to obey the rhythm of the quill. You sit at one of the desks now. The wood is hard and cold beneath your arms. The quill feels brittle between your fingers, the feather stiff. You dip it into the ink, but the liquid clings sluggishly to the nib, reluctant to flow. When you press it to the parchment, the line is faint, broken, the ink refusing to spread. You exhale, fogging the surface, and try again. The result is only slightly better, the ink grudgingly forming letters that stagger across the page. Around you, the sisters remain patient. Their lips move silently, reciting the words they copy, prayer woven into each stroke. One adjusts her candle, its flame tilting precariously in the draught. Another rubs her hands briskly together, then dives back into her work. The scratch of quills rises and falls like a strange music, interrupted only by the occasional cough or the thud of a dropped tool. An odd anecdote recorded in the margins of a manuscript tells of a sister who accidentally left a fingerprint on her parchment, preserved in ink for centuries. The print is still visible today, a ghost of a human hand marked in the middle of sacred text. Was it the result of clumsy cold fingers? Most likely. but it stands now as proof that these works were made by women enduring nights of frost, their bodies leaving unintentional signatures in holy books. You feel your own hand stiffening. The quill slips, blotting the parchment. A drop of ink spreads like a frozen starburst. You grimace, then smile faintly. It is easy to imagine that dozens of similar blots lie hidden in manuscripts across Europe, silent witnesses to the cold that shaped them. Scholars have long debated whether nuns received more leniency in winter when producing texts. Some argue that abbesses pushed them harder, seeing winter as a season with fewer outdoor tasks, therefore demanding more writing. Others believe the opposite, that abbesses recognized the impracticality of frozen scriptoria and shifted focus toward prayer and meditation. The evidence is scattered, offering glimpses rather than answers. You lean back, staring at the faint, uneven lines you have written. They look fragile, but they hold meaning, just as the sisters' lives held meaning despite fragility. Every page they produced was born of discomfort, every letter carved from endurance. In the cold, the act of writing became more than duty. It became testament, proof that devotion persisted even when ink itself froze against it. The candle sputters beside you, casting long shadows across the desk. You rub your hands together, breath fogging, quill trembling, and you understand, the manuscripts preserved from these centuries are not just texts. They are frozen nights translated into ink, silent witnesses to the endurance of women who refuse to let the cold silence their devotion. The scriptorium fades behind you, but the air of exhaustion clings as you return to the dormitory once more. You lie back onto the straw, close your eyes, and wonder what filled the sisters' dreams in such long, cold nights. Did they escape into warmth? Did their imaginations carry them beyond stone walls and icy corridors, into places of hearths, of sunlight, of family kitchens they had left behind? Writings from medieval mystics suggest that dreams were not dismissed lightly in convents. Some nuns recorded visions in their journals, describing radiant light, heavenly voices, or encounters with saints during the fragile hours of sleep. Chroniclers often framed these as divine communications, evidence that God touched his brides even as they shivered in their straw beds. For some, sleeplessness and cold may have blurred into visions, exhaustion painting prayer with strange colors. But not every dream was holy. A curious note in a visitation report scolds a group of novices for confessing that they often dreamed of food steaming loaves, roasted meats, honey dripping from combs. The inspector called such dreams temptations of the flesh, but you can understand them easily. Hungry bodies conjure feasts as naturally as tired minds conjure warmth. You imagine waking from such a dream to the reality of cold bread and thin gruel, the disappointment sharp enough to sting. Modern scholars debate how much of these recorded visions were genuine mystical experiences and how much were byproducts of deprivation. Sleep science today tells us that hunger, cold, and exhaustion all provoke vivid dreams, sometimes hallucinatory in nature. Yet for the sisters, the distinction may not have mattered. Whether born of God or of the body, the dream still carried meaning. Every vision, every flicker of the mind in the dark, was woven into the fabric of devotion. You curl deeper into the blanket, letting your own mind drift. The straw scratches your cheek, but your thoughts move elsewhere. You picture a fire crackling in a village home, warmth soaking into the walls, the smell of bread rising. You see children laughing near a hearth, families gathered with full bowls in their hands. The dream feels almost real, your body responding with longing so sharp it aches. For a fleeting moment, you are not in a convent at all, you are in the life you left behind. And then, the draught cuts across your skin, and the dream shatters. You open your eyes to the cold, the stone, the breath of sisters clouding the dark. You realize how painful that must have been for them, to dream of warmth and wake to frost. Perhaps that is why so many turn dreams into visions, because only by transforming longing into holiness could they bear the disappointment of dawn. One odd anecdote preserved in the letters of a prioress describes a nun who claimed she dreamed nightly of angels wrapping her in cloaks of fire. The abbess praised her for receiving divine comfort, but it is easy to imagine another explanation. Her body craved warmth so intensely that her mind gave her flames in sleep. Still, the story lived on, told and retold, a reminder that even suffering could be sanctified through interpretation. You think of the quiet rebellion of dreams, visions of food, warmth, family that no abbess could fully police. Even in silence, even in obedience, the mind wandered where the body could not. In this sense, sleep itself became a secret act of freedom, a realm where the convent's rules could not quite reach. The sisters may have woken to cold stone, but in their dreams, they walked barefoot through meadows, sat by hearths, or feasted at tables laden with bread. The debate among modern historians remains. Were dreams in convent chronicles genuine mystical insights, or carefully curated tales meant to inspire others? Some argue they reveal the raw psychological toll of deprivation, cloaked in religious language. Others insist they testify to authentic spiritual experiences, shaped by faith but rooted in reality. You find yourself leaning toward both dreams as survival, visions as faith, inseparable in the convent night. You close your eyes again, letting the cold press in, and imagine the dormitory full of women dreaming at once. Each pallet holds a story, each breath a prayer, each dream a bridge between body and spirit. Some dream of angels, some of loaves, some of warmth. All of them, in their way, endure. By now you have grown used to the rhythm of convent life: cold, prayer, silence, and fragile sleep. But occasionally the stillness of winter nights was broken by outsiders. The convent was not entirely sealed off. Noble families, bishops, or patrons visited, often in search of both spiritual counsel and material reassurance that their donations were used well. Imagine a wealthy patron stepping into the dormitory one icy morning, their fur-lined cloak heavy, their boots thick with wool, their breath hidden by layers. Contemporary chronicles record moments of shock when such visitors saw the austerity of convent life. One bishop in the 13th century noted in his visitation report that he found the sisters sleeping on straw in great cold, with little covering, and he urged the abbess to provide more blankets. His tone is half pity, half pride, as though the suffering proved the convent's piety, but also demanded that donors supply aid. You can almost see the noblewoman beside him, her jeweled hands clutching a muff, eyes widening at the sight of veiled figures curled beneath coarse wool. Visitors must have smelled it too: straw, damp stone, tallow smoke, and unwashed wool blending into the cold air. To outsiders, the dormitory may have seemed harsh to the point of cruelty, yet the sisters themselves accepted it as their daily offering, and the gap between perception and reality created an odd tension. What looked like misery to one was devotion to another. An odd anecdote survives in the writings of a 14th century French chronicler. He describes how a visiting noble laughed softly when he saw a novice curled tightly with her knees to her chest, mistaking her posture for childishness. The abbess, indignant, replied that the girl was folded like prayer itself, bent before the Lord. The moment captures how easily outsiders misunderstood what the sisters called devotion and what others would call discomfort. Scholars continue to debate the role of patronage in shaping convent life. Did wealthy donors, horrified by the austerity they witnessed, encourage abbesses to soften conditions with better bedding and heating? Or did they, impressed by the severity, demand that nuns remain symbols of holy endurance? The records suggest both, leaving a murky picture of influence and expectation. You cannot know for certain whether the nuns' lives were made easier by compassion or harsher by admiration. You picture now a group of visiting nobles standing stiffly in the dormitory, their cloaks brushing straw, their jeweled belts glittering faintly in the candlelight. Around them, sisters lie wrapped in wool, faces pale but calm, their silence unbroken. The visitors whisper among themselves, shocked and fascinated. Perhaps one feels pity, another envy, another discomfort. They will carry these impressions back into the world beyond the convent walls, shaping how society imagines the holy women within. For the sisters, such visits must have been jarring. Imagine lying half asleep, only to wake with a nobleman's shadow cast across your palate, or a lady's perfume mingling with the straw's odor. Did the nuns feel exposed, ashamed, or quietly proud that their suffering was on display as a living sermon? No rulebook can answer such questions. Only the cold stone remembers their reactions. One unusual record from England mentions that some visitors were offered the chance to sleep in the dormitory for a night, as a test of devotion. Few accepted, and those who did often left before dawn, defeated by the cold. You can almost see it, a nobleman tossing on straw, pulling his fur cloak tighter, cursing silently as frost crept down the wall. Meanwhile, the sisters slept on, accustomed to their discomfort, unmoved by what undid the outsider. You turn onto your side, imagining yourself as such a visitor. The wool scratches, the straw pokes, the draught slips under the blanket. Your stomach grumbles from thin gruel. The candle sputters, shadows dancing. You think, could I endure this for one night, let alone for a lifetime? And in that moment, you understand why outsiders left both awed and unsettled. What was normal to the sisters was unimaginable to those raised in softer homes. The convent was a paradox to outsiders. It was both admired and pitied, celebrated and scorned. And in that paradox lies the truth. The nuns' winter nights were not staged performances but lived realities, yet those realities were constantly reframed by visitors who saw them through the lens of their own lives. As the nobles step back into the frosty cloister, their cloaks swaying, the dormitory returns to silence. The sisters close their eyes again, unbothered, their discipline unbroken. The visitors will carry stories of harshness or holiness. The nuns will simply return to their sleep. The visitors' footsteps fade, leaving behind only the echo of whispers. Once again, the convent folds inward, its rhythms unbroken. Yet, even within these walls, debates about sleep and comfort were not absent. From the 12th century onward, records from synods and visitations reveal that the question of bedding, blankets, and even whether straw sacks were too soft became subjects of dispute among church authorities. It might seem trivial now, but in the medieval mind, the smallest details of daily life carried spiritual weight. One synodal decree from northern France stated bluntly that beds shall be plain, without excess of straw, cloth, or cushion, lest the sisters grow idle. The language suggests suspicion of any softness. Too much straw was considered indulgence, too many blankets, a temptation to sloth. You imagine abbesses counting the layers on each pallet, scrutinizing whether a novice had stuffed her sack too full, weighing the line between discipline and leniency. Chroniclers often mention these disputes with dry commentary. A 15th century writer recorded a case where a convent was chastised for using feather pillows. The bishop declared them unsuited for women vowed to poverty, and they were removed. The sisters returned to straw, their necks aching anew. It is a strange image. Holy women scolded not for sin of the soul, but for the softness of their sleep. Yet not every authority agreed. Some abbesses argued fiercely that inadequate warmth bred sickness, which in turn burdened the community. An unusual letter from a German abbess pleads with her bishop to allow more blankets during a brutal winter, writing that frozen bodies do not rise swiftly to prayer. The bishop's reply is lost, but the letter itself reveals the tension. Devotion demanded austerity, but survival demanded mercy. Scholars remain divided on how strictly these rules were enforced. Some suggest they were ideals, proclaimed in synods but softened in daily practice. Others believe abbesses upheld them rigidly, shaping communities where cold was embraced as proof of piety. Archaeological traces, thin bedding fibers preserved in damp soils, lists of donated cloth offer glimpses but no definitive answer. History, like the dormitory at night, keeps many of its truths in shadow. You shift on your straw pallet, wondering how such debates sounded to the sisters themselves. Did they roll their eyes at bishops who demanded harder beds? Did they whisper thanks for an abbess who slipped them an extra blanket? The chronicles rarely record their voices, only the voices of men in power or women in charge. Yet the small rebellions already described, herbs in straw, cats smuggled into bed, suggest that the nuns had their own quiet opinions, expressed through action rather than argument. One curious anecdote tells of a prioress who permitted extra straw only if it was gathered by the sisters themselves. The act of labour justified the comfort. If they were willing to trudge into fields, cut reeds, and haul bundles back through snow, then God would not begrudge them an easier night's sleep. You can almost see the procession-veiled figures dragging sacks of straw through frost, laughing softly at the absurdity of working so hard just to make their beds a little less punishing. The image lingers. Debates over softness, arguments over blankets, bishops scolding, abbesses pleading. It reveals how even in matters of sleep, the medieval church sought to regulate the boundary between body and soul. To rest too well was to risk sin. To rest too poorly was to risk health. The balance was delicate, contested, and endlessly shifting. You lie still now, straw poking your back, blanket itching your chin, draft sliding under the pallet. You feel the weight of those old arguments pressing into the cold, and in that moment you realize the debates themselves were part of the sisters' reality, shaping their nights as surely as the frost on the walls. They were never free simply to sleep. Even rest was a battleground of holiness. The bell rings again, distant but insistent. Another hour calls, another prayer summons. The debates fade into the dark, and the sisters rise, obedient not to comfort, but to rhythm. The bell's echo lingers as the sisters shuffle back into the dormitory. You return with them, straw crunching faintly underfoot, and notice how easily their steps fall back into rhythm. It strikes you that routine itself was perhaps the greatest defense against the cold and sleeplessness. In a world where comfort was scarce, habit replaced it. Habit became a kind of shield. Medieval monastic writers often spoke of consuetudo, the power of custom. To do the same thing, at the same hour, every day, was not a burden but a way to train the body and mind to accept hardship without resistance. One Benedictine commentator even suggested that habit dulls the bite of cold, as prayer dulls the ache of hunger. You sense the truth of it now. Repetition transforms suffering into background noise. Picture the dormitory over years, even decades. A novice, shivering on her first winter night, curls tightly on straw, tears prickling her eyes. Yet the same woman, 20 years later, lies down in the same straw with calm acceptance, her body hardened, her mind softened into obedience. The transformation is not sudden but gradual, a long shaping of body to stone and frost. A quirky note from a visitation account mentions an elderly nun who claimed she could no longer sleep on soft bedding when visiting her family home. She insisted the feather bed felt like drowning in geese, and begged to return to her convent straw. The remark reads half comic, half tragic, proof that habit had reshaped not only her comfort, but her very sense of belonging. Scholars continue to ask whether such adaptation was resilience or resignation. Did the sisters truly cease to feel the cold, or did they simply stop naming it suffering? Was the numbness a victory of faith, or the body's surrender? Letters and chronicles offer no single answer. Some describe joy in hardship, others quietly confess misery. The debate endures, reflecting the layered complexity of human endurance. You watch the sisters prepare for rest once more. Each movement is efficient, unthinking, blanket pulled, veil adjusted, body curled. There is no fumbling now, no hesitation. The actions are as ingrained as the psalms they chant daily. Even discomfort becomes ritual when repeated long enough. The sounds of the dormitory settle into their nightly rhythm. Straw rustling, quiet sighs, the faint creak of wood. Together, they form a kind of music, an unintentional lullaby born of routine. You lie down among them, and for the first time the cold feels less like an enemy and more like a constant companion, not kinder, but familiar. One unusual report from Italy notes that abbesses sometimes reminded their sisters that each night in cold is rehearsal for the grave. The words may sound severe, yet they reveal how endurance was framed, not as punishment, but as preparation. To sleep in discomfort was to practice detachment from the body, to train for the ultimate letting go. The thought is stark, but it explains why so many bore hardship with equanimity. And yet, small gestures of humanity remained. A novice might tug her blanket tighter around a neighbor, or an elder sister might cough gently to break the oppressive silence, reminding others that they were not alone. Even in routine, warmth appeared not from fires, but from the steady pulse of community. You close your eyes and feel yourself absorbed into that rhythm. Cold remains, straw pricks, hunger hums in your belly, but the routine soothes. The bell will ring again and again, but the body will rise because it always has. The night is no longer a threat. It is simply the next step in an endless circle of prayer. Work, sleep, prayer again. The realization settles over you like a blanket. Survival here was not about fighting the cold, but about folding it into life until it lost its edge. Habit did not erase hardship, but it dulled it, turning pain into background hum, turning endurance into second nature. The rhythm of habit steadies the sisters, yet in the depths of winter, bodies still faltered. You notice one nun shifting uncomfortably in her sleep, her face drawn tight. She coughs once, then again, the sound scraping harshly in the silence. Illness was never far from these dormitories, and cold nights made it all the more likely to creep into weary lungs. Medical accounts from convent infirmaries record a litany of winter ailments: fevers, chills, coughs, aching joints. Without glass in windows or fires to warm them, the sisters lived in constant dampness, a breeding ground for sickness. Straw bedding turned mouldy when wet, cloaks remained damp for days, and the chill pressed relentlessly into bones. You can almost feel it now, the ache in your chest, the sting in your throat, the way every breath feels heavier than the last. A curious note in a 13th century convent manual advised sisters to chew dried sage leaves before bed to sweeten the breath and protect the lungs. The logic was part medicine, part prayer. Herbs carried healing, but faith sealed it. You imagine a sister slipping a brittle leaf into her mouth, chewing slowly as its bitter taste spreads across her tongue, whispering a psalm as she tries to believe it will keep the night's chill from reaching too deeply. Scholars continue to debate whether convents were havens of health or traps of disease. Some argue that the structure, with its emphasis on cleanliness, order, and limited contact with the outside world, provided protection. Others counter that austerity, thin diets, little sleep, unheated dormitories made the sisters more vulnerable. Mortality records suggest both. Communities sometimes spared plagues that ravaged towns, yet also suffering from waves of fevers that cut down half a house in a single season. You glance again at the coughing nun. Her neighbor shifts, pulling her blanket slightly to cover the sick woman's shoulder, a small gesture of care that transcends rule or silence. These moments were not uncommon. Letters from abbesses describe sisters nursing one another in the cold, passing cups of hot broth, whispering prayers. Though infirmaries existed, the first line of comfort often came from the woman beside you on straw, willing to sacrifice her own warmth for yours. One odd anecdote survives in a visitation record. A group of sisters placed heated bricks wrapped in cloth at the feet of their sick companions. The practice was scolded as luxury, but the fact that it was noted shows its persistence. You can almost feel the rough weight of a brick against your soles, the heat slowly fading through the cloth until it cooled into useless stone. Comfort brief, but desperately welcome. The smell of illness must have mingled with the usual odors of straw and wool, the sour scent of fever sweat, the sharp tang of herbal poultices rubbed onto skin. Imagine lying in the dark, your neighbor's body hot with fever beside your pallet, while you whispered prayers that the cough would not spread to you. Fear was constant, but so too was compassion. In such nights, survival was communal, not individual. Scholars puzzle over how strictly the sick were separated. Some evidence suggests they were moved to infirmaries quickly. Other reports describe entire dormitories filled with coughing women, too many ill to isolate. The inconsistency leaves space for imagining. Some winters quiet, others filled with the chorus of wheezing. The night turned into a vigil not of prayer but of breath. And yet, the nuns endured. Illness did not excuse them entirely from rhythm. Records show that even the sick were expected to join in prayer when possible. Their voices thin but present. Imagine the sound. A line of coughs punctuating psalm verses, wheezes rising between chants. It was not beautiful, yet it was honest. A chorus of frailty offered as devotion. You lie back, pulling your blanket tighter, listening to the imaginary sounds of that winter dormitory. Coughs, prayers, shuffling feet. The cold presses down harder when sickness lingers, but warmth is found in gestures, an extra fold of wool, a shared sip of broth, a hand brushing sweat from a brow. For all its severity, the convent night was also threaded with tenderness. And that tenderness, quiet and unrecorded though it may be, was perhaps as holy as any psalm sung in chapel. The winter night deepens again, and you realize that sound itself becomes part of survival. In the convent dormitory, silence was a rule, yet silence was never truly absolute. Instead, the night filled with a strange music, rhythms of breath, coughs, creaks, rustles that stitched the sisters together in ways no chant could. Monastic rules speak often of the great silence, the vow that forbade unnecessary speech from dusk until dawn. For the sisters, this meant no whispered conversations to distract from prayer, no giggles from novices sharing secrets. Yet silence, once imposed, amplified every other noise. Imagine lying on your pallet, hearing every breath of the women around you, each one a fragile tether to life. Records from medieval visitations sometimes describe abbesses scolding novices for whispering in the dark. One report from an English convent chided the younger women for foolish chatter when the mind should be at rest. But another chronicle confesses that human voices often broke the silence in winter when the cold gnawed too fiercely. You picture two girls curled in their straw, whispering encouragement, trying to trick themselves into sleep by sharing scraps of childhood memory. An unusual note in a German manuscript mentions sisters humming psalms under their breath at night, too softly to be called speech, but audible enough to soothe. Perhaps these hums wove through the dormitory like threads, calming the restless, distracting from the cold. The line between discipline and disobedience blurred when survival demanded sound. Scholars remain divided on how strictly silence was observed. Some insist it was rigidly enforced, broken only by coughs or groans. Others argue that abbesses, though stern, allowed small mercies, knowing that whispered words could carry women through long nights. The debate continues, unresolved, leaving us to imagine the dormitory as a place both hushed and alive with secret murmurs. You lie still and listen. A cough rattles at the far end of the hall, followed by the faint rustle of straw as someone shifts. Another sister breathes in rhythm, long and slow, her exhalations puffing into the air like quiet bells. Somewhere near you, a novice hums the opening notes of a psalm, low enough to escape censure, high enough to catch in your ear. Together, these sounds form a tapestry more comforting than silence. One quirky anecdote, preserved in the diary of a visiting monk, tells of a novice who snored so loudly that the prioress moved her bed to the far corner of the dormitory. The monk, with dry humour, wrote that the snore became her prayer, unceasing through the night. The line makes you smile. Even discomfort became sanctified when framed as devotion. The smells of the dormitory join the sounds. Tallow smoke faint on the air, wool and straw pungent, a whiff of herbs from someone's hidden sachet. The mixture is earthy, raw, and inescapably human. You imagine lying with eyes shut, ears filled with the orchestra of breath and bodies, nose full of the dormitory's unfiltered reality. For all the convent's austerity, life pressed through the cracks of discipline. Historians debate whether such sensory realities undermined or strengthened devotion. Did the constant noise and smell distract from prayer, dragging the mind toward the body? Or did they reinforce humility, reminding each sister that she was one of many, bound by shared frailty? The question lingers, as unresolved as the silence itself. You close your eyes and sink into the soundscape. The rustle of straw, the sighs of fatigue, the hum of a psalm all blend into something hypnotic. The cold does not vanish, nor does hunger, but the noises of the dormitory wrap around you like a second blanket. You are no longer alone in your suffering. You are part of a chorus of endurance. And in that moment you understand, silence was never about absence of sound. It was about presence, the presence of shared life, of women breathing and enduring together, of a rhythm that carried them through nights that might otherwise have broken them. The dormitory grows still again, though stillness never means absence. Your eyes adjust to the dimness, and you notice how shadows move in tandem with the faint flicker of a candle kept near the door. The light is weak, and yet it shapes the whole room. It falls across pallets, glimmers against the frost lining the walls, and throws long, wavering silhouettes of veils and blankets. In the convent night, light was always scarce, but that very scarcity made it powerful. Accounts from medieval convents reveal how precious candles were. Beeswax, reserved for liturgical use, was costly. Tallow, cheaper, smoked heavily and carried a greasy, acrid scent. Candles in dormitories were rationed, often limited to one or two for the entire hall. Imagine lying in near darkness, staring at that single flame, its glow the only anchor against complete blackness. For many sisters, it became more than light, it became a companion. A curious note in a visitation report describes an abbess who required a small lantern to remain burning in the dormitory, symbolizing Christ's eternal light. But another chronicle criticizes such practices as wasteful, insisting the dark was more fitting for humility. The contrast reveals an enduring debate. Should the night hold some glow of comfort, or should darkness itself be embraced as discipline? Scholars are still divided on how often dormitories kept candles burning. Some argue that the risk of fire made it rare, citing reports of straw catching alight from carelessness. Others insist the symbolic value outweighed the danger, at least in wealthier houses. The truth likely varied, some nights lit by faint flame, others swallowed by darkness. You lie back, watching the candle's light tremble. Its glow paints the rafters above like ribs of gold, then dims as the wick falters. Shadows stretch and bend across the sisters' faces, carving lines of devotion and fatigue. For one woman, the glow is a reminder of prayer. For another, it is a torment, keeping her from rest. Light, like cold, was experienced differently by each body, each mind. One unusual anecdote tells of a nun who confessed she feared the dark so deeply she begged for a candle to burn near her bed. The abbess scolded her, but the note lingers in the record as a rare glimpse of vulnerability. Fear of darkness was not unholy. It was human. And though silence buried such fears most of the time, occasionally they slipped out, written into margins, whispered into confessionals. The smells of light were as strong as the sight. Beeswax released a sweet, honeyed perfume, faint but comforting. Tallow, in contrast, left behind an acrid smoke that stung the throat, clinging to veils and hair. Imagine drifting towards sleep with the greasy tang filling your lungs, reminding you of the fire's presence even when you tried to close your eyes. The candle was not just light, it was scent, it was sound, the hiss of fat, the crackle of a weak wick. You roll onto your side and notice how the candle's glow turns ordinary things into strange visions. A blanket folds into the shape of a crouched figure. A beam in the ceiling stretches like a looming cross. Even the frost along the walls gleams like painted glass. Shadows and light together create illusions. half comforting, half unsettling. Perhaps this is why some abbesses banned candles entirely. Too many minds wandered when given light to play with. Yet for many sisters the flame was holy. To stare into its heart was to meditate on God, to see in its fragile endurance a reflection of their own lives. An elderly nun in a 15th century chronicle is said to have whispered each night, "As this flame burns, so do I." You can imagine her lying there, her eyes fixed on the glow, her breath steady, her soul finding calm in the rhythm of flickering light. Historians question whether light truly eased their sleep or made it harder. Did the glow soothe fears, or did the smoke and shadows keep them restless? The evidence cannot answer. But perhaps the truth lies in variety. For some, light was comfort. For others, it was burden. In that, the candle mirrored life itself, never the same for all, always different in the eyes of those who beheld it. The wick sputters once more, flame bending low, nearly dying. For a moment, the dormitory plunges toward blackness. Then the light steadies, small but stubborn, glowing against the stone. You watch it with weary eyes, and as you drift toward sleep, you realize the flame is not eternal, but its defiance matters. It endures the draughts, the smoke, the darkness, just as the sisters endure their winters. The candle burns low, and when it finally gutters out, the dormitory sinks into blackness so complete it feels like a second skin. Your eyes strain, but there is no shape, no shimmer, only the press of darkness. In this depth of night, the convent reveals its truest character, a place where time itself feels frozen, where you exist only in breath and thought. Monastic commentators often describe darkness as a test. Some wrote that it stripped away distraction, leaving only the raw presence of God. Others feared it, warning that the mind, left alone in shadow, might wander into temptation. For the sisters lying in straw, the dark was both teacher and adversary. It pressed against their eyelids, filled their lungs with stillness, and left them face to face with themselves. Imagine lying there, heart pounding faster than you wish, every creak of wood amplified. The absence of light magnifies every sound. A cough, a sigh, a shift of straw. Even your own pulse seems louder. You are reminded of how fragile life is, how thin the barrier between body and void. Perhaps this is why so many nuns described their nights as vigils, not merely sleep. Darkness itself became a prayer, whether they intended it or not. A curious anecdote appears in a 14th century chronicle. A novice, frightened by the dark, claimed to see glowing eyes at the foot of her bed. The abbess dismissed it as imagination, though the girl insisted it was a demon. In truth, it might have been a cat or even moonlight reflecting on frost, but the terror was real. The story survived because it captured the way darkness invited visions both holy and fearful. Scholars continue to argue whether such night visions were genuine mystical experiences or products of exhaustion and deprivation. Some insist they reflect profound spiritual encounters. Others see them as hallucinations of weary minds. The debate circles endlessly, but perhaps the distinction mattered less to the women themselves. What they saw in the dark became part of their faith, whether born of heaven or hunger. You lie perfectly still, listening. The darkness is so dense that you almost hear it, a pressure against your ears, a hum without tone. Your thoughts drift, unmoored by sight. Shapes form in your mind. Halos, faces, flames, food. You cannot tell whether you are praying or dreaming. The boundary between the two dissolves in blackness. One unusual practice mentioned in a visitation record describes sisters holding small wooden crosses in their hands as they slept. In the dark, the touch of wood reassured them, anchoring them to faith when their eyes could not see. You can almost feel it now, the smooth surface warmed by your palm, the edges digging faintly into your skin, a reminder that devotion was tangible even when light was gone. The absence of light also reshaped time. Without flame or moon you could not tell the hour. Only the bell broke the monotony, and between bells minutes stretched endlessly. Imagine lying awake, unsure whether you had slept for moments or hours, waiting for the next toll to cut the silence. For some, this timelessness must have been maddening. For others, liberating. In darkness, you were freed from the tyranny of clocks, bound only to prayer and endurance. An odd tidbit from a Flemish convent tells of a nun who claimed she could sense dawn by the warmth in the air before anyone else. She insisted that even in darkness, she knew when the sun was rising. The Chronicle notes this with skepticism, but it lingers as a reminder that the body, denied sight, sharpens other senses. Perhaps she truly could feel subtle changes, her skin attuned to shifts others missed. You pull the blanket tighter, though it offers little. The dark feels heavier than the wool pressing against you. Yet slowly, as breath steadies and thoughts blur, the darkness becomes less enemy and more cradle. Without sight, the body surrenders. The mind drifts. Sleep comes not in spite of darkness, but because of it, as if the absence of light carries you away. And so the dormitory rests, dozens of women breathing in unison, eyes closed against nothingness, bodies curled in straw. The night is absolute, but within it, fragile peace lingers. The cold remains, hunger remains, rules remain. Yet for a few hours, the sisters are free from bells and labour. Darkness, however stern, gives them rest. The darkness loosens at last. A faint greyness creeps into the dormitory, subtle at first, then growing until it blurs the edges of veils and blankets. The sisters stir slowly, their breath still fogging, their limbs stiff with cold. It is not warmth that wakes them, but duty. The bell soon follows, its toll steady and inescapable, summoning them to prime, the first office of daylight. The long winter night has ended, though its weight remains in their bones. Documents from medieval convents confirm that prime was both prayer and threshold, the formal crossing from night's austerity into day's labour. For nuns, it meant rolling from straw, smoothing habits, and filing silently into chapel once more. Sleep was not remembered, nor was it discussed. It dissolved into the rhythm of prayer, as if the night were merely another offering placed before God. Yet behind this discipline lay fatigue. Imagine standing in the chapel as the psalms begin, eyelids heavy, muscles aching from restless hours. The chant is soft, but your voice cracks, rising with the others only out of habit. Some sisters nod slightly, catching themselves before slumber reclaims them. Still, the words flow, binding exhaustion into liturgy. A curious anecdote from a 15th century convent describes how one abbess allowed her sisters to splash their faces with cold water before prime, a mercy intended to wake them. The Chronicle adds with dry humour that the shock of icy water often made them more miserable than alert. You can almost feel it now, freezing liquid striking skin already numbed by the night. The sisters endured it anyway, their devotion measured as much by discomfort as by prayer. Scholars continue to debate whether these routines were sustainable over decades. Some argue the discipline broke bodies prematurely, while others insist it forged resilience that extended lifespans. The records give mixed testimony. Lists of nuns who lived into their 70s sit beside accounts of novices dead at 20. The truth lies in the tension between fragility and endurance, between human need and divine aspiration. You walk with them into the cloister. The air is biting, but the sky has shifted less a blanket of darkness, more a pale wash of silver. Frost clings to hedges, and your breath rises sharply as you exhale. Work awaits, tending fires, preparing bread, clearing snow. The sisters move without complaint, each step a continuation of the rhythm that began long before dawn. And so, the pattern of life continues. Each winter night teaches them the same lesson, that sleep is not theirs to claim fully, that warmth is scarce, that silence must cradle endurance. Yet each night also proves something greater that they endure together. The dormitory is not a chamber of despair, but of resilience, where whispered prayers, smuggled cats, hidden embers, and fragile habits weave survival into devotion. One odd little tale recorded in the margins of a convent ledger captures this spirit. A nun, exhausted after weeks of bitter cold, murmured, half asleep, "Lord, if heaven be warmer than this, I shall be content." Her words, half prayer, half joke, were preserved by a sympathetic sister. They remind us that even in the hardest winters, humour found a place beside holiness. You return to your straw pallet one last time in imagination, letting the scene settle around you. The frost-glazed walls, the smell of tallow smoke, the sound of steady breath, the faint glow of a dying candle. You understand that these women did not sleep as you do. Their rest was fragmented, their nights austere. Yet in their endurance lies a different kind of peace, a devotion born not of comfort but of constancy. The dormitory fades, the bell fades, the cold fades. Only the rhythm remains. Prayer, silence, sleep, prayer again. The pattern that shaped centuries of women who gave their nights to something greater than themselves. Now, as our story drifts toward its close, let your breath slow. Picture the dormitory once more, not as a place of harshness, but as a rhythm gently receding. The frost on the walls softens into mist. The straw beneath you quiets, no longer poking, no longer itching. It becomes only a surface, steady and calm. Around you, the sisters breathe in unison, their fatigue melted into rest. The bell is silent now, its echo far away. Even the draughts through the shutters grow faint, transforming into a soft breeze, as if the night itself exhales in relief. The long winter hours are behind you. The weight of rules, of hunger, of cold, has loosened. What remains is stillness. In this softened vision, you are no longer shivering. Instead, warmth seeps through not from fires or blankets, but from the quiet knowledge that endurance always gives way to dawn. The sisters you have followed through these nights are at peace, their hardships dissolving into memory. Their faith has carried them, and now that faith carries you too, into rest. Your own breath deepens, your own body releases. The images of frost, straw, and flickering candles blur gently at the edges, fading into calm greyness. There is no bell now, no summons, only silence, soft and safe. Let yourself sink into that silence. Let the rhythm of their endurance become your rhythm of sleep. The night has been long, but dawn has come, and you are free to close your eyes without fear of interruption. Rest now.